In the beginning, there is the garden, not Eden, but something far more seductive, far more dangerous. It is the paradise of the sleeper, where consciousness dreams it is awake, where the ego sits upon its throne of beautiful lies, governing. A kingdom built from carefully selected truths and meticulously curated blindness. You know this place well, though you may not recognize it at first glance. It is the landscape of your daily existence, the familiar terrain where you move with such confidence, such certainty, believing yourself to be the author of your own story, the master of your own fate. But look closer. Look with the eyes that see beyond seeing, and you will begin to perceive the elaborate architecture of this sleeper's paradise, the intricate maze of mirrors and shadows that you have mistaken for reality itself. Here, in this realm of the unconscious dreaming itself, conscious, the persona reigns supreme. This is your public face, your social mask, the carefully crafted presentation of self that you have learned to inhabit so completely that you have forgotten it is a costume at all. The persona is not evil. It is necessary, even beautiful in its way. It is the bridge between your inner world and the outer realm of others, the diplomatic envoy that negotiates the complex treaties of human relationship. But when the mask fuses with the face, when the role becomes the entire play, when the persona expands to colonize the whole of your identity, then you have entered the sleeper's paradise, where dreams masquerade as waking life. In this garden of unconsciousness, every flower blooms with the nectar of sweet illusion. You feast upon certainties that crumble at the first touch of genuine inquiry. You drink deeply from wells of projected meaning, mistaking the reflections dancing on the surface for the depths below. The ego, that necessary but limited structure of identity, builds its palace with the stones of what it knows, what it can control, what it can understand. But in doing so, it creates walls that keep out not only danger, but also the very mystery that gives life its meaning. How comfortable this paradise is, how reassuring in its predictability. Here you know who you are, or rather you know who you have agreed to be. You are your accomplishments, your relationships, your beliefs, your history. You are the story you tell yourself about yourself, the narrative thread that weaves together the scattered moments of your existence into something that feels coherent, purposeful, meaningful. The ego delights in this story, polishing it like a precious stone, adding new chapters that support its central thesis, that you are who you think you are, that life is what you believe it to be, that reality conforms to the boundaries of your understanding. But beneath the floorboards of this well-appointed consciousness, something moves in the darkness. It is not malevolent, though the ego experiences it as a threat. It is not chaotic, though the persona perceives it as disorder. It is the shadow, not the Freudian repository of repressed desires, but something far more profound and necessary. The shadow is your unlived life, your unexpressed potential, your disowned wholeness. It carries within its dark embrace all the aspects of your being that the ego has deemed unacceptable, inappropriate, or inconsistent with the carefully maintained image of who you should be. In the sleeper's paradise, this shadow self becomes the source of all projection, the invisible puppeteer that pulls the strings of your emotional reactions to others. When you feel inexplicably drawn to someone, it is often because they embody qualities that live in exile. Within your own shadow, when you feel instantly repelled by another, it is frequently because they mirror back to you the aspects of yourself that you have banished from conscious recognition. The shadow speaks through your judgments, your attractions, your aversions, a constant commentary on the contents of your own unconscious that you mistake for objective observations about the world. This is the supreme irony of the sleeper's paradise. The more we insist on being only who we think we are, the more we become puppets of who we refuse to be. The ego's attempt to maintain control over the narrative of self actually surrenders control to the very forces it seeks to exclude. In rejecting the darkness within, we become unconsciously governed by it. In refusing to acknowledge our capacity for cruelty, we become cruel in ways we cannot see. In denying our potential for foolishness, we become the fools of our own unconscious drama. Yet this paradise offers such compelling rewards for those who maintain its illusions. There is the comfort of knowing your place in the social order, the security of having fixed opinions about complex realities, the pleasure of feeling righteous in your judgments, the satisfaction of believing you have solved the puzzle of existence. The persona provides a sense of stability in an inherently unstable universe, a feeling of continuity in the face of constant change, an experience of agency in a cosmos that often seems to operate according to laws beyond human comprehension or control. The sleeper's paradise is maintained through a sophisticated system of defenses that the ego employs to protect its carefully constructed reality. Rationalization transforms uncomfortable truths into comfortable explanations. Projection relocates internal conflicts onto external targets. Denial simply refuses to admit the existence of what threatens the established order. Intellectualization lifts emotional realities into the safer realm of abstract concepts. Each defense mechanism serves as a guardian at the gates of consciousness, deciding what may enter and what must be turned away. But perhaps the most powerful guardian of all is the ego's capacity for spiritual bypassing, the ability to use even profound truths as building materials for the very prison they were meant to dissolve. The ego is remarkably adaptable, capable of co-opting the language of awakening to reinforce the structures of sleep. It can speak eloquently of the shadow while continuing to project it. It can acknowledge the limitations of the persona while remaining completely identified with it. It can even recognize the existence of the unconscious while maintaining the illusion that consciousness encompasses the totality of who we are. In this paradise of the sleeper, relationships become elaborate halls of mirrors, each person reflecting back to the others their own unconscious contents while believing they are seeing objective reality. Love becomes possession disguised as devotion. Conflict becomes a dance of mutual projection where neither party recognizes their own contribution to the discord. Intimacy becomes the sharing of personas rather than the meeting of authentic selves. The ego seeks in others what it cannot find in itself: completion, validation, understanding, not realizing that these treasures can only be discovered through the perilous journey into the depths of one's own being. The sleeper's paradise extends far beyond personal relationships into the realm of collective unconsciousness, where entire cultures dream together the same dreams of meaning and purpose. Ideologies become collective personas, national identities become shared masks, belief systems become communal defenses against the anxiety of not knowing. The individual ego finds comfort in merging with these larger structures of identity, gaining the illusion of significance through participation in something greater than itself, not realizing that this participation often requires the sacrifice of individual consciousness rather than its expansion. Time itself takes on a different quality in this paradise of unconsciousness. The ego lives primarily in the dimensions of past and future, drawing its identity from memory, projecting its desires onto imagined tomorrows. The present moment, with its immediacy and unpredictability, becomes simply the thin line connecting the known past to the planned future. Life becomes a series of rehearsals for a performance that never quite arrives, or a collection of nostalgic recreations of moments that have already passed. The eternal now, where transformation actually occurs, remains largely unexplored territory. D. Ego's relationship to suffering reveals another crucial aspect of the sleeper's paradise. Pain is seen as a problem to be solved rather than a teacher to be welcomed. Discomfort is medicated, distracted from, or explained away rather than investigated for its deeper messages. The persona develops elaborate strategies for avoiding the very experiences that might crack open its protective shell. Yet it is precisely this resistance to suffering that maintains the prison walls of unconsciousness. For suffering, when met with awareness rather than avoidance, becomes the great alchemical agent of transformation, the fire that burns away what is false to reveal what is eternally true. In this garden of unconsciousness, creativity becomes domesticated, channeled into forms that reinforce, rather than challenge, the established order of identity. Art serves the ego's need for expression, while carefully avoiding the dangerous territories where genuine revelation might occur. The shadow's wild creativity, its capacity for destruction and renewal, its hunger for the taboo and the transformative, remains locked away, occasionally breaking through in dreams or slips of the tongue, or moments of inexplicable fascination with what the persona claims to despise. The sleeper's paradise has its own mythology, its own sacred stories that support the ego's understanding of how life works. These are not the ancient myths that guided our ancestors toward initiation and transformation, but modern mythologies of progress, success, control, and security. The hero's journey becomes the entrepreneur's journey. The sacred marriage becomes the perfect relationship. The dark night of the soul becomes clinical depression requiring pharmaceutical intervention. The old stories that once carried the wisdom of transformation are replaced by new stories that promise transformation. Without the necessity of genuine change, sexuality in this paradise becomes yet another arena where the ego seeks to maintain control while the shadow presses for recognition. The persona creates elaborate rules about appropriate desire, acceptable fantasy, proper expression, often based more on social conditioning than authentic feeling. Meanwhile, the shadow carries the fullness of our erotic nature, including its darkness, its wildness, its capacity for surrender and dissolution. The tension between these two forces creates a constant undercurrent of dissatisfaction, a sense that something essential is missing from even our most intimate encounters. The ego's relationship to death provides perhaps the clearest window into the nature of the sleeper's paradise. Physical death becomes the ultimate enemy to be conquered rather than the natural culmination to be embraced. But more importantly, the ego refuses all smaller deaths, the daily dyings that are required for growth, the necessary endings that make space for new beginnings, the symbolic deaths that initiate us into deeper levels of being. In the sleeper's paradise, we cling to what we have been rather than surrendering to what we might become. Spirituality itself becomes colonized by the ego's agenda in this paradise of unconsciousness. The search for transcendence becomes another possession to be acquired, another achievement to be added to the persona's collection of identities. Enlightenment becomes a goal to be reached rather than a recognition of what is already present. The infinite mystery of existence becomes reduced to concepts that the mind can grasp and control. Even the profound teachings of wisdom traditions become tools for the ego's aggrandizement rather than instruments for its transformation. Yet there are moments, when cracks appear in the foundation of this carefully constructed paradise. They come unbidden, unplanned, unwelcome. A sudden death that shatters our illusion of control, a betrayal that reveals the gap between our idealized image of another and their actual complexity, a failure that exposes the fragility of our carefully laid plans. a glimpse of beauty so profound that it renders all our explanations inadequate. A moment of recognition when we see our own unlived life reflected in another's courage to be authentic. These cracks in the mirror of the sleeper's paradise are not accidents. They are the shadow's way of communicating across the barriers erected by the ego. They are love letters from the unconscious, written in the language of disruption and dissolution. They are invitations to step beyond the boundaries of who we think we are and discover who we actually might be. But the ego, in its dedication to maintaining the familiar order, often works quickly to seal these cracks, to explain away these glimpses, to return to the comfortable confines of the known. The tragedy of the sleeper's paradise is not that it exists. It is a necessary stage in the development of consciousness, a way station on the journey toward individuation. The tragedy is when we mistake it for our final destination, when we choose the safety of sleep over the adventure of awakening, when we prefer the comfort of illusion to the challenging beauty of truth. For the paradise of the sleeper is ultimately a prison, albeit one with walls so beautifully decorated that we mistake them for horizons. In this paradise, we become curators of our own museum of self, carefully arranging the artifacts of our identity in displays that tell the story we want to believe about who we are. We become tour guides of our own inner landscape, but guides who only visit the safe, well-lit areas, while warning visitors away from the dangerous regions where real treasure might be found. We become editors of our own experience, cutting out the scenes that don't fit the narrative, splicing together moments that create the illusion of a coherent, controllable life. The relationships we form in this paradise become mutual agreements. To maintain each other's illusions, we fall in love not with the person, but with how the person reflects our own projected desires and disowned qualities. We maintain friendships that support our self-image, while avoiding those that might challenge our comfortable self-deceptions. We choose communities that reinforce our worldview while maintaining careful distance from perspectives that might introduce unwelcome complexity into our simplified understanding of existence. Work, in the sleeper's paradise, becomes another means of ego gratification rather than an expression of authentic purpose. We choose careers that enhance our persona, that provide the external validation the ego craves, that offer the illusion of security and control. The shadow's deeper calling, the work that would emerge from our authentic nature rather than our conditioned identity, remains unheard beneath the noise of societal expectations and personal ambitions. We become successful by the world's standards while remaining strangers to our own soul's true vocation. The body, too, becomes conscripted into the service of the ego's agenda in this paradise of unconsciousness. Physical appearance becomes another mask to be perfected, another role to be performed. Health becomes a project of control rather than a relationship of listening and response. Aging becomes an enemy to be defeated rather than a teacher to be honored. The body's wisdom, its instinctual knowledge, its emotional intelligence, its capacity for presence and surrender, becomes subordinated to the mind's need to direct and manage the experience of embodied existence. Money and possessions take on mythical significance in the sleeper's paradise, becoming not merely tools for survival and comfort, but symbols of worth, security, and status. The accumulation of wealth becomes a way of keeping score in the ego's game of comparison and competition. Material objects become extensions of the persona, carefully chosen to communicate the desired image to the world. The shadow's relationship to money, its capacity for both generous abundance and necessary poverty, its understanding that true wealth cannot be possessed, remains largely unconscious, expressing itself only in symptoms of dissatisfaction and compulsive acquisition. Even our suffering becomes domesticated in this paradise of the sleeper. Pain is categorized, pathologized, medicated, or explained away rather than received as a sacred messenger carrying information about the state of our souls. Anxiety is treated as a disorder rather than recognized as the ego's natural response to the proximity of truth. Depression is seen as a chemical imbalance rather than understood as the psyche's way of forcing a necessary descent into the underworld of transformation. The shadow's suffering, its grief for the unlived life, its rage at being denied expression, its desperate longing for integration, remains unacknowledged, festering in the unconscious until it erupts in symptoms that the ego cannot ignore. The sleeper's paradise has its own calendar of celebrations and observances, rituals that reinforce the ego's understanding of what life means and how it should be lived. Birthdays become occasions for ego gratification rather than moments of reflection on the mystery of existence. Holidays become opportunities for persona performance rather than gateways into the sacred dimensions of life. Weddings become elaborate, theatrical productions celebrating the merger of two egos rather than the sacred union of two souls. Funerals become exercises in denial rather than initiations into the reality of impermanence and the preciousness of each unrepeatable moment. Yet, beneath all this careful construction, beneath all this elaborate architecture of identity and meaning, something stirs. It is not content to remain forever in exile. It is not satisfied with the scraps of expression it receives through dreams and symptoms and slips of the tongue. The shadow grows restless in its underground chambers, pressing against the foundations of the ego's carefully built world. The self, that greater organizing principle that encompasses both light and dark, consciousness and unconscious ego, and shadow, begins to exert its gravitational pull, calling for the integration that alone can bring wholeness. This stirring beneath the surface of consciousness creates a subtle unease in the sleeper's paradise. Things that once brought satisfaction begin to feel hollow. Achievements that once provided meaning start to feel empty. Relationships that once felt fulfilling begin to feel like elaborate performances. The very success of the ego in creating its paradise becomes the source of a mysterious discontent, a nameless hunger that no amount of external acquisition can satisfy. The persona begins to feel the weight of its own performance, the exhaustion that comes from constant vigilance against the emergence of unwanted aspects of the self. The smile becomes harder to maintain. The appropriate responses require more effort to produce. The mask begins to chafe against the skin it covers, creating irritation that no amount of adjustment can soothe. This is the first sign that the sleeper's paradise is not the final destination, but merely a way station on a much longer journey. Dreams become more vivid, more disturbing, more insistent in their symbolic communications from the unconscious realm. The shadow begins to appear in nighttime visions, sometimes as a threatening figure to be fled from, sometimes as a mysterious companion offering forbidden knowledge. The ego dismisses these nocturnal visitors as mere neurological static, random firings of an exhausted brain, but some deeper part of the psyche recognizes them as emissaries from the unlived life, carrying messages too important to be ignored forever. Synchronicities begin to multiply, those meaningful coincidences that seem to suggest a deeper pattern. Operating beneath the surface of ordinary causation, books fall open to significant passages. Conversations with strangers touch on themes that echo our deepest questions. Natural phenomena seem to mirror our internal states with uncanny precision. The ego explains these away as confirmation bias, as the mind's tendency to create patterns where none exist, but the soul recognizes them as communications from the greater self, breadcrumbs leading out of the forest of unconsciousness. The body, too, begins to rebel against the tyranny of the persona's demands. Illness arrives not as random misfortune, but as a mysterious teacher carrying lessons about the cost of living divided against ourselves. Fatigue emerges not merely from physical exertion, but from the exhausting work of maintaining psychological splits. Pain manifests not only in obvious injury, but in the subtle violence we do to ourselves when we refuse to honor the fullness of our nature. In the sleeper's paradise, we become connoisseurs of our own suffering, developing sophisticated theories about why life disappoints us, why others fail to understand us, why the world refuses to conform to our expectations. We become experts in the art of complaint, the science of blame, the philosophy of victimhood. The ego finds a perverse satisfaction in these narratives of wounded innocence, these stories that cast us as the heroes of tragic dramas rather than the unconscious authors of our own experience. Yet even this suffering serves the greater purpose of transformation, for it is precisely the ego's inability to find lasting satisfaction within the confines of the sleeper's paradise that creates the pressure necessary for awakening. The very failure of our attempts to find fulfillment through ego gratification becomes the force that eventually propels us beyond the boundaries of who we think we are. The relationships we form in this paradise become increasingly unsatisfying. As their projective nature becomes more apparent, we begin to sense that we are not truly seeing the people in our lives, but rather using them as screens onto which we project our own unconscious contents. Love reveals itself to be often a form of spiritual materialism, where we possess others emotionally rather than truly knowing them. Conflict exposes itself as a dance of mutual unconsciousness, where both parties fight with their own shadows while believing they are fighting with each other. Work begins to feel like an elaborate game, with rules that no longer make sense, goals that no longer inspire, rewards that no longer satisfy. The career that once provided identity starts to feel like a costume that no longer fits. The achievements that once brought pride begin to feel like someone else's accomplishments. The success that was supposed to provide meaning reveals itself as a sophisticated form of spiritual materialism. The accumulation of external validation to fill an internal void that cannot be filled from outside. The sleeper's paradise has its own forms of spirituality, its own versions of the sacred that serve to reinforce rather than challenge the ego's dominion. These are the spiritualities of comfort rather than transformation, the practices that make us feel better about who we are rather than helping us discover who we might become. They offer the language of awakening without the substance of change, the appearance of depth without the actual journey into the unconscious realms where real transformation occurs. Prayer becomes petition rather than surrender. Meditation becomes another form of self-improvement, rather than a practice of ego dissolution. Sacred texts become sources of confirmation for existing beliefs, rather than challenges to transcend the limitations of current understanding. Even the most profound teachings become domesticated, reduced to inspirational quotes that adorn the walls of the ego's palace, without threatening its fundamental structure. Yet it is precisely the ego's success in creating this paradise that contains the seeds of its own transcendence, for the ego, in its very attempt to maintain control, demonstrates the impossibility of maintaining control. In its effort to create security, it reveals the fundamental insecurity of all conditional existence. In its desire for permanence, it highlights the impermanent nature of everything it seeks to preserve. The sleeper's paradise becomes a kind of spiritual experiment that proves its own hypothesis false, showing through lived experience that fulfillment cannot be found in the realm of the known, the controlled, the possessed. The shadow grows stronger, through repression, like a muscle that develops through resistance. Every act of denial feeds its power. Every moment of projection increases its influence. Every choice to remain unconscious adds to the pressure that will eventually force consciousness to expand beyond its current boundaries. The shadow becomes not the enemy of growth, but its primary catalyst, not the obstacle to awakening, but its most essential prerequisite. As the pressure builds in the unconscious realm, the carefully maintained order of the sleeper's paradise begins to show signs of strain. The persona requires more energy to maintain. The defenses demand more sophisticated justifications. The projections become more elaborate and less convincing. The stories we tell ourselves about ourselves begin to sound hollow, even to our own ears. The mirror of self-perception, once so reliable in reflecting back our preferred image, begins to show distortions that cannot be explained away. This is the beginning of what Jung called the dark night of the soul, not the mystical experience, described by spiritual traditions, but the psychological crisis that occurs when the ego's paradise begins to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. It is the first stirring of what the alchemists called the nigredo, the blackening phase that must precede any genuine transformation. It is the shadow's announcement that it will no longer remain content in exile, that the time has come for the conscious personality to expand, to include what it has rejected. The ego experiences this stirring as a threat to its very existence. And in a sense, it is right. For the journey that lies ahead will require nothing less than the death of the ego as the sole organizing principle of identity. Not the destruction of the ego, for it has its proper place and function, but its dethronement from the position of absolute monarch of the psyche. The ego must learn to become a servant of the greater self, rather than mistaking itself for the master of existence. But this death, terrifying as it appears to the ego, is not an ending, but a beginning. It is not an annihilation, but a metamorphosis. Like the caterpillar that must dissolve completely in the darkness of the chrysalis before emerging as a butterfly, the ego must undergo its own form of death and rebirth if the full potential of human consciousness is to be realized. The sleeper's paradise must be left behind, not because it is evil, but because it is too small to contain the vastness of who we actually are. The call to leave this paradise does not come from outside, but from within, from the shadow that has grown weary of exile, from the self that demands recognition, from the soul that hungers for wholeness. It is a call that cannot be refused forever, though it can be delayed, resisted, misunderstood, for eventually, the very structure of the sleeper's paradise becomes too confining for the expanding consciousness that it was designed to protect. The protection becomes a prison, the security becomes a cage, the comfort becomes a form of suffering more acute than any external threat. This is the great paradox of the sleeper's paradise. It succeeds so completely in protecting the ego from danger that it ultimately becomes the greatest danger to the soul's evolution. It preserves the status quo so effectively that it prevents the very changes that would bring genuine fulfillment. It maintains order so perfectly that it excludes the chaos from which new life emerges. It sustains the known so reliably that it closes off access to the unknown realms where mystery and meaning await discovery. And so, the stage is set for the great adventure of consciousness, the hero's journey that leads not to external treasure, but to internal integration, not to conquest of the outer world, but to reconciliation with the inner cosmos. The sleeper's paradise, with all its beautiful illusions and comfortable deceptions, must eventually be recognized for what it is. Not reality itself, but a carefully constructed defense against reality. Not awakening, but the most sophisticated form of sleep, The journey beyond this paradise will require courage of a kind that the ego cannot imagine, for it will demand the willingness to die to who we think we are in order to discover who we actually are. It will require the humility to admit that our carefully constructed understanding of existence may be largely illusory. It will demand the faith to step into the unknown without guarantee of safe return to the familiar shores of ego identity. But this journey, though perilous, is not optional for those who seek authentic existence. For the soul will not be satisfied with paradise built upon denial. The self will not remain forever content with partial recognition. The shadow will not accept permanent exile from the land of consciousness. Sooner or later, through crisis, or grace, through suffering or insight, through breakdown or breakthrough, the sleeper must awaken from the beautiful dream of paradise and begin the real work of becoming whole. The garden of unconsciousness, with all its sweet illusions and seductive comforts, stands ready to be transcended. The persona, with all its protective strategies and social competencies, awaits transformation into a tool of authentic expression rather than a substitute for genuine being. The ego, with all its careful constructions and defensive maneuvers, prepares for its own death and resurrection as a servant of consciousness rather than its master. The sleeper's paradise trembles on the edge of its own dissolution, and something magnificent waits to be born from its ashes. The first crack in the mirror approaches, and with it, the beginning of the end of the beautiful dream of unconsciousness. The shadow stirs more insistently now, no longer content with whispered communications. Through symptoms and dreams, the time of comfortable sleep draws to a close, and the time of dangerous awakening begins to dawn. The moment arrives uninvited, as all true moments do. You are standing before the mirror of your carefully constructed existence, adjusting the familiar mask, rehearsing the well-practiced lines of your daily performance, when suddenly, lightning, a flash of recognition so brilliant, so searing, that for one impossible instant you see through the elaborate theater of your own life and glimpse something raw, something real, something utterly unexpected. This is the first crack in the mirror, the hairline fracture that will eventually spiderweb across the entire surface of your reflected reality until nothing remains but shattered glass and the terrible, beautiful truth that lies beyond all reflections. It comes without warning, this moment of seeing, for if the ego could anticipate it, it would surely find a way to prevent it, to explain it away, to seal the breach before the light of authentic vision could penetrate the carefully maintained darkness of unconsciousness. Perhaps it comes through the betrayal of someone you trusted completely, someone whose goodness you had made essential to your own sense of safety in the world. One moment you are secure in your knowledge of their character, confident in your ability to read the human heart, and the next you are staring at evidence that renders your entire system of perception suspect. The shock reverberates not just through your understanding of this particular person, but through your fundamental belief in your own capacity to see clearly, to judge accurately, to trust your own senses. Or perhaps it arrives through the sudden death of someone who seemed permanent in your universe, someone whose presence had become so woven into the fabric of your reality that their absence tears holes you never imagined possible. In that moment when the phone rings with news that changes everything, when the words penetrate your consciousness like stones thrown through glass, you discover that the solid ground beneath your feet was always an illusion, that the security you believed in was built upon the most fragile of foundations. It might emerge through a moment of inexplicable attraction to someone who embodies everything your persona has rejected, everything your carefully cultivated identity stands against. You find yourself drawn to the rebel when you have always been the conformist, fascinated by the artist when you have always been the pragmatist, captivated by the wild one when you have always been the tame and responsible citizen. In this attraction, you catch a glimpse of your own unlived life, the shadow self that has been waiting in exile for recognition, for permission to exist, for integration into the totality of who you are. Sometimes the crack appears through failure, not the small, manageable failures that can be absorbed into the ego's narrative of learning and growth, but the catastrophic failures that shatter the very foundations upon which your identity was built. The career that collapses despite your best efforts, the relationship that ends despite your deepest commitment, the dream that dies despite your unwavering faith. In these moments of ultimate failure, the ego's illusion of control reveals itself as precisely that, an illusion, and something deeper than success or failure begins to make itself known. The crack might manifest through a moment of unexpected beauty, so profound that it overwhelms all your categories of understanding, all your systems of meaning-making. You are walking through an ordinary day when suddenly the light falls across a face, a landscape, a moment of human interaction in such a way that eternity blazes through the temporal, and you are struck speechless by the recognition that reality is far more mysterious, far more sacred, far more alive than your concepts could ever contain, or it could arrive through the simplest of recognitions, catching sight of your own reflection in an unguarded moment, and seeing not the familiar face of your persona, but a stranger, someone whose eyes hold depths you have never explored, whose expression carries stories you have never allowed yourself to tell. In that moment of startled non-recognition, you realize that you have been living with a version of yourself that is only a fraction of the whole, that beneath the surface of your conscious identity lies an entire continent of being that remains unmapped, unexplored, unknown. However it comes, this first crack in the mirror of self-perception creates a kind of cognitive vertigo, a disorientation that the ego immediately attempts to correct. The rational mind rushes in with explanations, interpretations, ways of containing the experience within familiar frameworks. It was just stress, you tell yourself. It was just a coincidence. It was just a moment of confusion. The persona mobilizes all its resources to seal the breach, to restore the comfortable order, to return to the familiar landscape of the known and the controlled. But something has been seen that cannot be unseen. Some boundary has been crossed that cannot be uncrossed. Some knowledge has been tasted that cannot be untasted. The crack may be temporarily sealed, but it has left a permanent weakness in the structure, a place where pressure will continue to build, where the next fracture will inevitably appear. The mirror will never again be quite as solid, quite as reliable, quite as convincing as it once was. This is the terror and the wonder of the first crack. It reveals that what we have taken to be solid is actually fragile. What we have believed to be permanent is actually temporary. What we have assumed to be the whole is actually only a part. The ego, which has based its entire existence on the reliability of its self-image, suddenly confronts the possibility that this image might be not just incomplete, but fundamentally illusory. In the aftermath of this first crack, you may find yourself obsessively returning to the moment of breakage, trying to understand what happened, trying to explain it away, trying to integrate it into your existing worldview without allowing it to fundamentally alter that worldview. The ego is nothing if not creative in its strategies for maintaining the status quo while appearing to acknowledge change. It can accommodate almost any experience, any insight, any revelation, as long as it remains in control of the interpretation, the meaning, the implications for future action. But the shadow, having tasted momentary recognition, becomes more insistent in its communications. Dreams become more vivid and disturbing. Slips of the tongue become more frequent and revealing. Projections onto others become more intense and contradictory. The carefully maintained splits in the psyche begin to create stress fractures throughout the entire system of the personality. What was once a smooth and seamless presentation of self begins to develop rough edges, inconsistencies, moments of inexplicable behavior that perplex both yourself and others. The first crack often triggers what Jung called enantiodromia, the psychological principle by which things transform into their opposites when pushed to extremes. The perfectionist becomes suddenly attracted to chaos. The responsible one begins to crave irresponsibility. The helper becomes fascinated by selfishness. The rational one finds themselves drawn to the irrational. These reversals are not mere rebellion against previous patterns, but the psyche's attempt to balance itself, to compensate for the one-sidedness that has characterized the ego's development. Relationships begin to shift in subtle but significant ways as the first crack creates new forms of perception. You may find yourself seeing your loved ones differently, not through the lens of your needs and projections, but with a clarity that is both more compassionate and more discerning. Or you may discover that relationships which once felt deeply satisfying now feel somehow hollow, based more on mutual support of each other's illusions than on genuine intimacy and understanding. The crack reveals not just the fragility of the persona, but its beauty as well. For the first time, you may recognize the elegance of the performance you have been giving, the skill with which you have crafted your public face, the artistry involved in maintaining a coherent sense of self in the face of life's constant challenges. This recognition brings both grief for what must be left behind and gratitude for what has served its purpose so well. Work and career may begin to feel like elaborate costumes that no longer fit properly. The goals that once motivated you may seem suddenly arbitrary. The achievements that once brought satisfaction may feel like someone else's accomplishments. This is not necessarily depression, though it may be mistaken for it. It is the natural result of consciousness beginning to expand beyond the boundaries that once contained it. The crack has let in light from regions of being that render the previous landscape of meaning inadequate. The body, too, responds to the first crack with new sensitivities, new awarenesses, new forms of intelligence. You may find yourself noticing physical sensations that were previously below the threshold of consciousness. Emotions may feel more intense, more immediate, less manageable through the usual strategies of control and suppression. The body begins to assert its own wisdom, its own needs, its own timeline for growth and change, often in direct contradiction to the ego's preferences and plans. Sleep becomes a different country, populated by dreams that carry urgent messages. From the unconscious realm, the shadow appears more frequently and more vividly, sometimes as a threatening figure to be fled from, sometimes as a mysterious guide offering forbidden knowledge. The ego may attempt to dismiss these nocturnal visitors as mere neurological static, but some deeper part of the psyche recognizes them as communications from the parts of yourself that have been waiting in exile for recognition. Sexuality may undergo profound shifts as the first crack allows previously unconscious desires and fantasies to surface. The careful boundaries that the persona has maintained around appropriate desire may begin to feel arbitrary, confining, disconnected from the deeper currents of erotic energy that flow through the shadow self. This can be deeply disturbing to an ego that has defined itself partly through its sexual restraint, its moral purity, its adherence to conventional expressions of desire. The crack often creates a heightened sensitivity to synchronicity, those meaningful coincidences that seem to suggest some deeper pattern operating beneath the surface of ordinary causation. Books fall open to precisely the passages you need to read. Conversations with strangers address exactly the questions you have been carrying, Natural phenomena mirror your internal states with uncanny precision. The ego may attempt to explain these away as confirmation bias or selective attention, but the soul recognizes them as communications from the greater self, breadcrumbs leading toward integration. Money and possessions may begin to feel differently, weighted in your life, as the crack reveals the arbitrary nature of many of the values by which you have measured success and security. The shadow's relationship to wealth, its capacity for both generous abundance and voluntary poverty, its understanding that true riches cannot be possessed, begins to make itself known through growing dissatisfaction with purely material measures of well-being. This first crack often precipitates what appears to be a crisis of faith, but is actually a crisis of false faith. The dissolution of belief systems that served the ego's need for certainty rather than the soul's hunger for truth. Religious or spiritual practices that once brought comfort may suddenly feel empty or hypocritical. Philosophical frameworks that once provided meaning may reveal themselves as elegant forms of spiritual materialism. The crack exposes the difference between beliefs that support growth and beliefs that prevent it. The persona, sensing the threat to its dominion, may respond to the first crack by doubling down on its performance, becoming more rigid, more perfect, more exemplary in its adherence to its chosen role. This is the ego's version of circling the wagons, creating stronger defenses against the encroaching forces of the unconscious. But this very rigidity often serves to widen the crack rather than seal it, for the psyche cannot long sustain such extreme one-sidedness without triggering compensatory movements from the shadow realm. Art and creativity may suddenly take on new significance as the crack opens channels of expression that have been blocked by the persona's need for appropriate self-presentation. You may find yourself drawn to forms of creative expression that your previous identity would have rejected as too dangerous, too revealing, too raw. The shadow's wild creativity begins to assert itself, demanding outlet, seeking integration into the conscious life. Time begins to feel different as the crack disrupts the ego's linear narrative of past, present, and future. Moments stretch into eternity. The present becomes more vivid and immediate. The past reveals new meanings that were invisible when viewed through the lens of the persona. The future becomes less predictable, less controllable, more open to possibilities that the ego never considered. This shift in temporal experience can be profoundly disorienting to a consciousness that has organized itself around planning, goal setting, and the illusion of linear progress. The crack often brings with it a period of intense introspection, a turning inward that the ego may resist as self-indulgent or unproductive. But this introspection is not narcissistic. It is the beginning of the great work of individuation, the process by which consciousness expands to include what has been unconscious, by which the personality develops beyond the limitations of the persona, by which the individual begins to embody their unique potential rather than conforming to collective expectations. Physical symptoms may manifest as the crack creates stress fractures throughout the entire system of the personality. Headaches, insomnia, digestive issues, mysterious pains. These are often the body's way of expressing the pressure created when consciousness begins to expand beyond the boundaries that have contained it. The ego interprets these symptoms as problems to be solved, but they are actually signals of transformation in progress, announcements that the old system can no longer contain the new energies that are seeking expression. The first crack reveals the profound difference between adaptation and authenticity, between fitting in and belonging, between being successful and being real. The persona, which has served as the primary tool of adaptation to social reality, suddenly reveals its limitations when measured against the deeper criteria of authentic existence. This can create a profound sense of alienation, not just from others, but from the very self you have believed yourself to be. Loneliness may intensify as the crack exposes the isolation inherent in persona-based relationships. You begin to realize that others have been relating to your mask rather than your face, your role, rather than your being, your performance rather than your essence. This recognition brings both grief for the superficiality of much human connection and hope for the possibility of more authentic forms of intimacy. The shadow's hunger for genuine recognition begins to make itself felt more acutely. The crack often precipitates what feels like a crisis of meaning, as the narratives that have given your life direction and purpose suddenly seem arbitrary, inherited rather than chosen, imposed rather than authentic. The goals you have been pursuing may appear to belong to someone else, your parents, your culture, your peer group, rather than emerging from your own deepest nature. This crisis is not a breakdown, but a breakthrough, not a loss of meaning, but the clearing away of false meanings to make space for authentic purpose to emerge. Professional life may become a source of increasing discomfort as the crack exposes the gap between who you are at work and who you are in your most private moments. The skills that have made you successful may feel like betrayals of your authentic nature. The recognition you receive may feel like rewards for a performance rather than acknowledgement of your true value. The shadow's desire for more authentic expression in your work life begins to create pressure that no amount of professional success can relieve. The crack reveals the profound exhaustion that comes from maintaining psychological splits, from keeping parts of yourself in exile, from performing a version of authenticity rather than simply being authentic. You begin to sense how much energy has been devoted to maintaining the persona, to suppressing the shadow, to keeping the unconscious unconscious. This recognition brings both relief, finally understanding the source of a nameless fatigue, and terror at the prospect of what might happen if you stop performing the familiar role. Sexuality often becomes a particularly sensitive area, as the first crack allows previously unconscious desires and fantasies to surface. The shadow's erotic nature, wild, untamed, unbound by the persona's moral constraints, begins to make its presence felt through fantasies, attractions, or impulses that the ego finds disturbing or inappropriate. This can create intense internal conflict as the carefully maintained sexual identity encounters aspects of desire that don't fit its approved narrative. The crack frequently manifests through what appears to be simple boredom, but is actually the soul's rebellion against a life that has become too small to contain its expanding awareness. Activities that once brought pleasure feel mechanical. Conversations that once felt meaningful seem shallow. Pursuits that once felt important appear suddenly arbitrary. This is not depression, but awakening, the natural response of consciousness, as it begins to outgrow the limitations that once defined it. Dreams take on new urgency and clarity as the crack creates openings for the unconscious to communicate more directly with the conscious mind. The shadow appears more frequently and more vividly, sometimes as a threatening figure representing everything the ego fears about itself, sometimes as a wise guide offering access to disowned powers and potentials. These dreams are not random, neurological events, but urgent communications from the parts of the psyche that have been silenced by the persona's dominion. The first crack often triggers a period of obsessive self-analysis as the ego attempts to understand and control the experience of seeing beyond its own boundaries. You may find yourself reading psychology books, attending workshops, seeking explanations that will allow you to integrate the experience without fundamentally changing your understanding of who you are. But the crack resists such domestication. It points toward transformation that cannot be managed or contained within existing frameworks. Relationships with family members may become particularly charged as the crack exposes the projective dynamics that have shaped these most intimate connections. You begin to see how much of your identity has been defined in reaction to or in harmony with family expectations. How much of your persona represents an adaptation to family dynamics rather than an expression of authentic nature. This recognition can create both liberation and grief as you realize how much of your life has been lived for others rather than from your own deepest center. The crack reveals the arbitrary nature of many of the beliefs that have structured your worldview, showing how much of what you have taken to be truth is actually inherited opinion, cultural conditioning, or collective agreement. This doesn't necessarily invalidate these beliefs, but it exposes their conditional rather than absolute nature. You begin to distinguish between what you truly know through direct experience and what you have simply accepted because it was presented by authoritative sources. Physical appearance may become a source of new confusion as the crack exposes the gap between how you see yourself and how you actually appear. Mirrors become unreliable, showing faces that seem to belong to strangers. Photos reveal expressions you don't remember making. You begin to realize how much your self-image has been based on internal fantasy rather than external reality, how much the persona has colonized even your most basic sense of physical identity. The first crack often brings with it a heightened awareness of time's passage and the inevitability of death. Not death as an abstract future event, but death as a present reality that gives weight and urgency to every choice, every moment, every opportunity for authentic expression. The ego's projects of permanence, career advancement, reputation building, legacy creation, begin to feel like elaborate forms of death denial rather than meaningful pursuits. Social interactions become more complex and challenging as the crack exposes the performative nature of much human communication. Small talk feels increasingly hollow. Professional networking seems like elaborate games of mutual deception. Even intimate conversations may feel scripted, as if everyone is reading from predetermined roles rather than speaking from authentic presence. The shadow's hunger for genuine human contact begins to make itself felt more acutely. The crack often precipitates what appears to be a moral crisis, but is actually a crisis of false morality, the recognition that many of the ethical principles by which you have lived serve the ego's need for righteousness rather than authentic conscience. You begin to distinguish between the morality of the persona, which is often based on external approval and internal judgment, and the deeper ethics of the self, which emerge from direct recognition of interconnection and compassion. Financial concerns may take on new complexity as the crack exposes the shadow's relationship to money and security. The ego's strategies for financial safety may suddenly seem inadequate or misdirected. You may find yourself either more anxious about money as you recognize the illusory nature of security, or less concerned with accumulation as you begin to trust in forms of abundance that cannot be deposited in bank accounts. The first crack frequently brings with it a new relationship to authority figures and institutions. Those who once seemed to embody wisdom or power may reveal themselves as fellow inhabitants of their own versions of the sleeper's paradise. Systems that once seemed solid and reliable may expose their human-made, arbitrary nature. This recognition can be both liberating and terrifying as the external structures that have provided guidance and stability reveal their conditional nature. Creativity may suddenly feel either blocked or overwhelmingly intense as the crack disrupts the persona's controlled expression of artistic impulses. The shadow's raw creative energy, unfiltered by considerations of appropriateness or approval, may surge toward the surface, demanding expression in forms that the ego finds uncomfortable or threatening. This can lead to either creative paralysis, or creative breakthrough, depending on how consciously the process is met. The crack often exposes the deep loneliness that has been masked by the persona's social competence. You begin to realize how much of your social life has been based on mutual performance rather than genuine connection, how much of your relationships have been arrangements for mutual ego support rather than authentic intimacy. This recognition brings both the pain of isolation and the possibility of more real forms of human contact. Physical health may undergo shifts as the crack creates stress throughout the entire system of the personality. The body, which has been adapted to maintain the persona's version of reality, must now adjust to new pressures, new energies, new forms of awareness. Symptoms that were previously ignored may demand attention. Energy patterns that were previously stable may become irregular. The body begins its own process of preparing for the transformation that consciousness is approaching. The first crack reveals the profound difference between happiness and joy, between pleasure and fulfillment, between success and satisfaction. The ego's achievements in creating comfort and security suddenly seem insufficient when measured against the soul's criteria for meaningful existence. This doesn't necessarily invalidate what has been accomplished, but it places these accomplishments in a larger context that exposes their limitations. Sleep patterns may shift as the crack creates new forms of communication between conscious and unconscious realms. You may find yourself waking at unusual hours with thoughts or insights that seem to come from somewhere beyond your normal mental processes. Dreams may become so vivid and meaningful that the boundary between sleeping and waking consciousness begins to blur. The unconscious, having found a crack through which to communicate, becomes more insistent in its messages. The crack often triggers a crisis of identity that goes far deeper than the usual questions of career, relationship, or lifestyle. You begin to question not just what you want to do or who you want to be with, but who you are at the most fundamental level. The very categories by which you have understood yourself, introvert or extrovert, successful or struggling, spiritual or material, begin to seem inadequate to capture the complexity of your actual experience. This crisis of identity is accompanied by what feels like a crisis of agency. The ego's sense of being in control of your choices and direction begins to waver as you recognize how much of your behavior is actually driven by unconscious forces, how much of your personality is actually a reaction to circumstances rather than an expression of authentic will. This can be terrifying for a consciousness that has built its sense of security on the illusion of self-direction. The first crack often brings with it a new relationship to failure and success, revealing these as categories that belong to the ego's dualistic understanding rather than the soul's more encompassing perspective. What you have labeled as your greatest failures may suddenly appear as your most important learning experiences. What you have celebrated as your greatest successes may reveal themselves as elaborate forms of spiritual materialism. The crack exposes the limitation of judging life by external criteria alone. Mental clarity may paradoxically both increase and decrease as the crack introduces new forms of awareness while simultaneously disrupting old patterns of thinking. You may find yourself seeing through illusions that previously seemed solid, while simultaneously feeling more confused about questions that once seemed settled. This is the natural result of consciousness expanding to include previously unconscious contents. The initial effect is often disorientation rather than increased understanding. The crack frequently exposes the addictive nature of the ego's strategies for maintaining its paradise. You begin to recognize how much of your behavior serves the function of mood regulation, anxiety management, or identity maintenance, rather than authentic expression or genuine response to present circumstances. This recognition can be humbling, and liberating simultaneously, revealing both the sophistication of the ego's survival strategies and their ultimate inadequacy for promoting genuine growth. Spiritual practices may undergo profound transformation as the crack exposes the difference between spirituality that serves the ego and spirituality that serves the self. Meditation may become less about achieving particular states and more about developing the capacity to be present with whatever arises. Prayer may shift from petition to surrender. Study of sacred texts may become less about accumulating knowledge and more about allowing understanding to transform the understander. The crack often precipitates what feels like a crisis of faith, but is actually the natural result of faith, expanding beyond the boundaries that have contained it. The God of the ego, the divine figure who supports our self-image and validates our worldview, must die for the God of the self to be born. This death of the familiar divine often feels like the deet of God altogether, creating a period of spiritual desert that is actually pregnant with new forms of sacred recognition. As the crack widens, you may begin to notice other people who are experiencing similar disruptions of their carefully maintained realities. These fellow travelers in the land of psychological transition become important companions, not because they provide answers or solutions, but because they offer the recognition that this experience of breaking open is not pathology, but the natural movement of consciousness toward greater wholeness. The first crack is both ending and beginning, destruction and creation, death and birth. It announces the conclusion of one phase of human development, the phase in which the ego and persona provide adequate containers for consciousness, and the commencement of another phase in which these structures must be transformed to serve a larger purpose. It is the initiation into what Jung called the second half of life, where the questions are no longer about achievement and adaptation, but about meaning and authenticity. The terror of this crack lies not in what it reveals about the world, but in what it reveals about the self. That you are not who you thought you were, that your life is not what you believed it to be, that reality is far more mysterious and challenging than your concepts could contain. But within this terror lies the seed of liberation, for the crack also reveals that you are far more than who you thought you were, that your life contains possibilities you never imagined, that reality is far more beautiful and meaningful than your limited perspective could encompass. And so it begins, the descent that every soul must make if it would know itself whole. The first crack has appeared in the mirror of your carefully constructed reality. And now something ancient and inexorable calls you downward into the underworld of your own psyche, into the depths that your daylight consciousness has spent. A lifetime avoiding. This is not a journey you choose, though you may pretend to have chosen it. This is not an adventure you plan, though the ego will attempt to map the territory and predict the outcome. This is the descent that chooses you, that claims you, that drags you by the roots of your being into the sacred darkness where all transformation begins. The shadow has grown tired of exile. The unconscious has grown weary of being unconscious, and the self, that greater organizing principle of your total being, demands recognition of its full complexity. Into the negredo you go, into the blackening phase that alchemists knew must precede any authentic transformation. Like base metal in the furnace, like seed in the dark soil, like caterpillar in the chrysalis, you must undergo dissolution before reconstitution, death before rebirth, chaos before new order can emerge. The ego recoils from this necessity, preferring the illusion of linear progress to the reality of cyclical transformation, choosing the fantasy of improvement to the actuality of metamorphosis. But the psyche has its own intelligence, its own timing, its own way of orchestrating the encounters that consciousness requires for its evolution. What appears from the ego's perspective as catastrophe reveals itself from the self's perspective as initiation. What seems like breakdown from the narrow viewpoint of the persona shows itself as breakthrough from the expanded vision of wholeness. The descent into darkness is not punishment, but invitation, not abandonment by grace, but immersion in the most profound form of grace, the grace that loves you enough to shatter your beautiful illusions in service of your authentic becoming. By new stories that promise transformation without the necessity of genuine change. Sexuality in this paradise becomes yet another arena where the ego seeks to maintain control while the shadow presses for recognition. The persona creates elaborate rules about appropriate desire, acceptable fantasy, proper expression, often based more on social conditioning than authentic feeling. Meanwhile, the shadow carries the fullness of our erotic nature, including its darkness, its wildness, its capacity for surrender and dissolution. The tension between these two forces creates a constant undercurrent of dissatisfaction, a sense that something essential is missing from even our most intimate encounters. The ego's relationship to death provides perhaps the clearest window into the nature of the sleeper's paradise. Physical death becomes the ultimate enemy to be conquered rather than the natural culmination to be embraced. But more importantly, the ego refuses all smaller deaths, the daily dyings that are required for growth, the necessary endings that make space for new beginnings, the symbolic deaths that initiate us into deeper levels of being. In the sleeper's paradise, we cling to what we have been rather than surrendering to what we might become. Spirituality itself becomes colonized by the ego's agenda in this paradise of unconsciousness. The search for transcendence becomes another possession to be acquired, another achievement to be added to the persona's collection of identities. Enlightenment becomes a goal to be reached rather than a recognition of what is already present. The infinite mystery of existence becomes reduced to concepts that the mind can grasp and control. Even the profound teachings of wisdom traditions become tools for the ego's aggrandizement rather than instruments for its transformation. Yet there are moments when cracks appear in the foundation of this carefully constructed paradise. They come unbidden, unplanned, unwelcome. A sudden death that shatters our illusion of control, a betrayal that reveals the gap between our idealized image of another and their actual complexity, a failure that exposes the fragility of our carefully laid plans, a glimpse of beauty so profound that it renders all our explanations inadequate, a moment of recognition when we see our own unlived life reflected in another's courage to be authentic. These cracks in the mirror of the sleeper's paradise are not accidents. They are the shadow's way of communicating across the barriers erected by the ego. They are love letters from the unconscious, written in the language of disruption and dissolution. They are invitations to step beyond the boundaries of who we think we are and discover who we actually might be. But the ego, in its dedication to maintaining the familiar order, often works quickly to seal these cracks, to explain away these glimpses, to return to the comfortable confines of the known. The tragedy of the sleeper's paradise is not that it exists. It is a necessary stage in the development of consciousness, a way station on the journey toward individuation. The tragedy is when we mistake it for our final destination, when we choose the safety of sleep over the adventure of awakening, when we prefer the comfort of illusion to the challenging beauty of truth. For the paradise of the sleeper is ultimately a prison, albeit one with walls so beautifully decorated that we mistake them for horizons. In this paradise, we become curators of our own museum of self, carefully arranging the artifacts of our identity in displays that tell the story we want to believe about who we are. We become tour guides of our own inner landscape, but guides who only visit the safe, well-lit areas while warning visitors away from the dangerous regions where real treasure might be found. We become editors of our own experience, cutting out the scenes that don't fit the narrative, splicing together moments that create the illusion of a coherent, controllable life. The relationships we form in this paradise become mutual agreements to maintain each other's illusions. We fall in love not with the person, but with how the person reflects our own projected desires and disowned qualities. We maintain friendships that support our self-image while avoiding those that might challenge our comfortable self-deceptions. We choose communities that reinforce our worldview while maintaining careful distance from perspectives that might introduce unwelcome complexity into our simplified understanding of existence. Work in the sleeper's paradise becomes another means of ego gratification rather than an expression of authentic purpose. We choose careers that enhance our persona, that provide the external validation the ego craves, that offer the illusion of security and control. The shadow's deeper calling, the work that would emerge from our authentic nature rather than our conditioned identity, remains unheard beneath the noise of societal expectations and personal ambitions. We become successful by the world's standards while remaining strangers to our own soul's true vocation. The body, too, becomes conscripted into the service of the ego's agenda in this paradise of unconsciousness. Physical appearance becomes another mask to be perfected, another role to be performed. Health becomes a project of control rather than a relationship of listening and response. Aging becomes an enemy to be defeated rather than a teacher to be honored. The body's wisdom, its instinctual knowledge, its emotional intelligence, its capacity for presence and surrender, becomes subordinated to the mind's need to direct and manage the experience of embodied existence. Money and possessions take on mythical significance in the sleeper's paradise, becoming not merely tools for survival and comfort, but symbols of worth, security, and status. The accumulation of wealth becomes a way of keeping score in the ego's game of comparison and competition. Material objects become extensions of the persona, carefully chosen to communicate the desired image to the world. The shadow's relationship to money, its capacity for both generous abundance and necessary poverty, its understanding that true wealth cannot be possessed, remains largely unconscious, expressing itself only in symptoms of dissatisfaction and compulsive acquisition. Even our suffering becomes domesticated in this paradise of the sleeper. Pain is categorized, pathologized, medicated, or explained away, rather than received as a sacred messenger, and carrying information about the state of our souls. Anxiety is treated as a disorder, rather than recognized as the ego's natural response to the proximity of truth. Depression is seen as a chemical imbalance, rather than understood as the psyche's way of forcing a necessary descent into the underworld of transformation. The shadow's suffering, its grief for the unlived life, its rage at being denied expression, its desperate longing for integration remains unacknowledged, festering in the unconscious until it erupts in symptoms that the ego cannot ignore. The sleeper's paradise has its own calendar of celebrations and observances, rituals that reinforce the ego's understanding of what life means and how it should be lived. Birthdays become occasions for ego gratification rather than moments of reflection on the mystery of existence. Holidays become opportunities for persona performance rather than gateways into the sacred dimensions of life. Weddings become elaborate, theatrical productions celebrating the merger of two egos rather than the sacred union of two souls. Funerals become exercises in denial rather than initiations into the reality of impermanence and the preciousness of each unrepeatable moment. Yet, beneath all this careful construction, beneath all this elaborate architecture of identity and meaning, something stirs. It is not content to remain forever in exile. It is not satisfied with the scraps of expression it receives through dreams and symptoms and slips of the tongue. The shadow grows restless in its underground chambers, pressing against the foundations of the ego's carefully built world. The self, that greater organizing principle that encompasses both light and dark, consciousness and unconscious ego, and shadow, begins to exert its gravitational pull, calling for the integration that alone can bring wholeness. This stirring beneath the surface of consciousness creates a subtle unease in the sleeper's paradise. Things that once brought satisfaction begin to feel hollow. Achievements that once provided meaning start to feel empty. Relationships that once felt fulfilling begin to feel like elaborate performances. The very success of the ego in creating its paradise becomes the source of a mysterious discontent, a nameless hunger that no amount of external acquisition can satisfy. The persona begins to feel the weight of its own performance, the exhaustion that comes from constant vigilance against the emergence of unwanted aspects of the self. The smile becomes harder to maintain. The appropriate responses require more effort to produce. The mask begins to chafe against the skin. It covers, creating irritation that no amount of adjustment can soothe. This is the first sign that the sleeper's paradise is not the final destination, but merely a way station on a much longer journey. Dreams become more vivid, more disturbing, more insistent in their symbolic communications from the unconscious realm. The shadow begins to appear in nighttime visions, sometimes as a threatening figure to be fled from, sometimes as a mysterious companion offering forbidden knowledge. The ego dismisses these nocturnal visitors as mere neurological static, random firings of an exhausted brain, but some deeper part of the psyche recognizes them as emissaries from the unlived life, carrying messages too important to be ignored forever. Synchronicities begin to multiply, those meaningful coincidences that seem to suggest a deeper pattern operating beneath the surface of ordinary causation. Books fall open to significant passages. Conversations with strangers touch on themes that echo our deepest questions. Natural phenomena seem to mirror our internal states with uncanny precision. The ego explains these away as confirmation bias, as the mind's tendency to create patterns where none exist. But the soul recognizes them as communications from the greater self, breadcrumbs leading out of the forest of unconsciousness. The body, too, begins to rebel against the tyranny of the persona's demands. Illness arrives not as random misfortune, but as a mysterious teacher carrying lessons about the cost of living divided against ourselves. Fatigue emerges not merely from physical exertion, but from the exhausting work of maintaining psychological splits. Pain manifests not only in obvious injury, but in the subtle violence we do to ourselves when we refuse to honor the fullness of our nature. In the sleeper's paradise, we become connoisseurs of our own suffering, developing sophisticated theories about why life disappoints us, why others fail to understand us, why the world refuses to conform to our expectations. We become experts in the art of complaint, the science of blame, the philosophy of victimhood. The ego finds a perverse satisfaction in these narratives of wounded innocence, these stories that cast us as the heroes of tragic dramas rather than the unconscious authors of our own experience. Yet even this suffering serves the greater purpose of transformation, for it is precisely the ego's inability to find lasting satisfaction within the confines of the sleeper's paradise that creates the pressure necessary for awakening. The very failure of our attempts to find fulfillment through ego gratification becomes the force that eventually propels us beyond the boundaries of who we think we are. The relationships we form in this paradise become increasingly unsatisfying. As their projective nature becomes more apparent, We begin to sense that we are not truly seeing the people in our lives, but rather using them as screens onto which we project our own unconscious contents. Love reveals itself to be often a form of spiritual materialism, where we possess others emotionally rather than truly knowing them. Conflict exposes itself as a dance of mutual unconsciousness, where both parties fight with their own shadows while believing they are fighting with each other. Work begins to feel like an elaborate game, with rules that no longer make sense, goals that no longer inspire, rewards that no longer satisfy. The career that once provided identity starts to feel like a costume that no longer fits. The achievements that once brought pride begin to feel like someone else's accomplishments. The success that was supposed to provide meaning reveals itself as a sophisticated form of spiritual materialism. The accumulation of external validation to fill an internal void that cannot be filled from outside. The sleeper's paradise has its own forms of spirituality, its own versions of the sacred that serve to reinforce rather than challenge the ego's dominion. These are the spiritualities of comfort rather than transformation, the practices that make us feel better about who we are rather than helping us discover who we might become. They offer the language of awakening without the substance of change, the appearance of depth without the actual journey into the unconscious realms where real transformation occurs. Prayer becomes petition rather than surrender. Meditation becomes another form of self-improvement rather than a practice of ego dissolution. Sacred texts become sources of confirmation for existing beliefs rather than challenges to transcend the limitations of current understanding. Even the most profound teachings become domesticated, reduced to inspirational quotes that adorn the walls of the ego's palace without threatening its fundamental structure. Yet it is precisely the ego's success in creating this paradise that contains the seeds of its own transcendence, for the ego, in its very attempt to maintain control, demonstrates the impossibility of maintaining control. In its effort to create security, it reveals the fundamental insecurity of all conditional existence. In its desire for permanence, it highlights the impermanent nature of everything it seeks to preserve. The sleeper's paradise becomes a kind of spiritual experiment that proves its own hypothesis false, showing through lived experience that fulfillment cannot be found in the realm of the known, the controlled, the possessed. The shadow grows stronger through repression, like a muscle that develops through resistance. Every act of denial feeds its power. Every moment of projection increases its influence. Every choice to remain unconscious adds to the pressure that will eventually force consciousness to expand beyond its current boundaries. The shadow becomes not the enemy of growth, but its primary catalyst, not the obstacle to awakening, but its most essential prerequisite. As the pressure builds in the unconscious realm, the carefully maintained order of the sleeper's paradise begins to show signs of strain. The persona requires more energy to maintain. The defenses demand more sophisticated justifications. The projections become more elaborate and less convincing. The stories we tell ourselves about ourselves begin to sound hollow even to our own ears. The mirror of self-perception, once so reliable in reflecting back our preferred image, begins to show distortions that cannot be explained away. This is the beginning of what Jung called the dark night of the soul, not the mystical experience described by spiritual traditions, but the psychological crisis that occurs when the ego's paradise begins to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. It is the first stirring of what the alchemists called the nigredo, the blackening phase that must precede any genuine transformation. It is the shadow's announcement that it will no longer remain content in exile, that the time has come for the conscious personality to expand, to include what it has rejected. The ego experiences this stirring as a threat to its very existence, and in a sense, it is right. 5. For the journey that lies ahead will require nothing less than the death of the ego as the sole organizing principle of identity, not the destruction of the ego, for it has its proper place and function, but its dethronement from the position of absolute monarch of the psyche. The ego must learn to become a servant of the greater self rather than mistaking itself for the master of existence. But this death, terrifying as it appears to the ego, is not an ending, but a beginning. It is not an annihilation, but a metamorphosis. Like the caterpillar that must dissolve completely in the darkness of the chrysalis before emerging as a butterfly, the ego must undergo its own form of death and rebirth if the full potential of human consciousness is to be realized. The sleeper's paradise must be left behind, not because it is evil, but because it is too small to contain the vastness of who we actually are. The call to leave this paradise does not come from outside, but from within, from the shadow that has grown weary of exile, from the self that demands recognition, from the soul that hungers for wholeness. It is a call that cannot be refused forever, though it can be delayed, resisted, misunderstood. For eventually, the very structure of the sleeper's paradise becomes too confining for the expanding consciousness that it was designed to protect. The protection becomes a prison, the security becomes a cage, the comfort becomes a form of suffering more acute than any external threat. This is the great paradox of the sleeper's paradise. It succeeds so completely in protecting the ego from danger that it ultimately becomes the greatest danger to the soul's evolution. It preserves the status quo so effectively that it prevents the very changes that would bring genuine fulfillment. It maintains order so perfectly that it excludes the chaos from which new life emerges. It sustains the known so reliably that it closes off access to the unknown realms where mystery and meaning await discovery. And so the stage is set for the great adventure of consciousness, the hero's journey that leads not to external treasure, but to internal integration, not to conquest of the outer world, but to reconciliation with the inner cosmos. The sleeper's paradise, with all its beautiful illusions and comfortable deceptions, must eventually be recognized for what it is, not reality itself, but a carefully constructed defense against reality, not awakening but the most sophisticated form of sleep. The journey beyond this paradise will require courage of a kind that the ego cannot imagine, for it will demand the willingness to die to who we think we are in order to discover who we actually are. It will require the humility to admit that our carefully constructed understanding of existence may be largely illusory. It will demand the faith to step into the unknown without guarantee of safe return to the familiar shores of ego identity. But this journey, though perilous, is not optional for those who seek authentic existence. For the soul will not be satisfied with paradise built upon denial. The self will not remain forever content with partial recognition. The shadow will not accept permanent exile from the land of consciousness. Sooner or later, through crisis or grace, through suffering or insight, through breakdown or breakthrough, the sleeper must awaken from the beautiful dream of paradise and begin the real work of becoming whole. The garden of unconsciousness, with all its sweet illusions and seductive comforts, stands ready to be transcended. The persona, with all its protective strategies and social competencies, awaits transformation into a tool of authentic expression rather than a substitute for genuine being. The ego, with all its careful constructions and defensive maneuvers, prepares for its own death and resurrection as a servant of consciousness rather than its master. The sleeper's paradise trembles on the edge of its own dissolution, and something magnificent waits to be born from its ashes. The first crack in the mirror approaches, and with it, the beginning of the end of the beautiful dream of unconsciousness. The shadow stirs more insistently now, no longer content with whispered communications. Through symptoms and dreams, the time of comfortable sleep draws to a close, and the time of dangerous awakening begins to dawn. The wrestling begins not with fanfare or conscious invitation, but in the quiet moments when the mind believes itself at rest. You sit in your familiar chair, perhaps reading, perhaps simply breathing, and suddenly there is another presence in the room, not external, but rising from within like mist from still water. It is not malevolent, this presence, yet neither is it entirely welcome. It carries the weight of everything you have refused to see, refused to claim, refused to name as your own. This is the angel of the unconscious, and it has come to wrestle like Jacob by the river Jabbok. You find yourself engaged in a combat you did not choose but cannot escape. The story echoes through the chambers of your psyche with the resonance of eternal truth, the solitary figure grappling with the divine messenger. Through the long watches of the night, neither yielding, both transformed. But this angel wears no flowing robes, carries no flaming sword. It appears instead as the face you glimpsed in the mirror this morning and quickly looked away from, the voice that speaks your secret thoughts in dreams, the autonomous force that moves through your life, leaving traces you pretend not to recognize. The wrestling ground is prepared long before conscious awareness arrives. Each projection you have cast upon the world becomes a training ground for this ultimate confrontation with the self. The difficult colleague who embodies everything you despise, there is your shadow practicing its holds. The impossible love that promises salvation through another's perfection, there is your anima learning the steps of this ancient dance. The authority figure whose approval you crave with the hunger of a starving child, there is your unintegrated father archetype, teaching you the moves that will later serve you in this deeper combat. But projection, that most cunning of psychological mechanisms, cannot protect you forever. The images you have cast upon the screen of the external world eventually fade, their power to convince diminishing as consciousness grows stronger, more curious, more willing to turn its gaze inward. What you once saw clearly in others, their selfishness, their weakness, their desperate need for love, begins to appear with uncomfortable clarity in the mirror of honest self-reflection. The enemy is no longer out there, safely contained in someone else's story. The enemy has come home. This homecoming of the shadow is perhaps the most disorienting aspect of the wrestling. For so long, the dark aspects of your nature have lived in exile, banished to the realm of the not me, projected onto convenient others who could carry the burden of your disowned qualities. The racist belongs to someone else's family. The coward lives in another's body. The petty, jealous, manipulative aspects of human nature are problems for other people to solve. You have kept your hands clean, your conscience clear, your self-image intact through the simple expedient of not looking too closely at the darkness that moves beneath the surface of your carefully maintained persona. But the unconscious is patient, and it is thorough. Each disowned aspect of your nature that you have projected outward eventually returns like a boomerang, demanding recognition, insisting on integration. The mechanism is elegant in its inevitability. What you cannot accept in yourself, you will encounter in the world until you learn to claim it as your own. The qualities you most vehemently reject in others are precisely the qualities seeking acknowledgement within your own psyche. The wrestling match has been arranged by forces far older and wiser than the ego's preferences. The angel appears first as irritation. A small thing, perhaps, a comment that strikes you as unnecessarily harsh, a gesture that seems deliberately dismissive, a tone of voice that carries what feels like unmistakable contempt. Your reaction is swift and certain. righteous indignation, hurt feelings, the satisfying clarity of knowing yourself to be wronged. But if you pause in that moment of reaction, if you resist the immediate urge to blame and defend, you might catch a glimpse of something else, a flicker of recognition, an uncomfortable resonance, the faint echo of your own voice speaking through another's words. This is the angel's first hold, the moment when projection begins to waver, when the boundary between self and other becomes permeable enough to allow uncomfortable truths to seep through. It is not yet wrestling, not yet the full confrontation that will demand everything of you. It is simply the first touch, the initial contact that announces the presence of an opponent worthy of your full attention. The progression from irritation to projection to active wrestling follows a pattern as old as consciousness itself. What begins as mild disturbance escalates to obsession as the psyche attempts to resolve the tension between inner and outer, between the image of yourself you prefer and the fuller reality that seeks expression. You find yourself thinking about the person who triggered this response at odd moments, lying in bed before sleep, walking alone, sitting in traffic. Their face appears uninvited in your mental space. Their words replay with stubborn persistence. Their actions demand interpretation and reinterpretation until the whole edifice of your carefully constructed inner world begins to shift and crack. This is when the wrestling truly begins, not with the external figure who first carried your projection, but with the inner forces that projection was meant to contain. The face that haunts your thoughts is your own face, seen from an angle you have never dared to examine. The voice that speaks uncomfortable truths is your own voice, finally freed from the constraints of polite self-deception. The opponent who seems so formidable, so worthy of your resistance, is the autonomous complex of your own disowned nature, rising from the depths of the unconscious to claim its place in the wholeness you are becoming. But autonomous complexes are not content to be ignored or reasoned with, or managed through spiritual bypassing or positive thinking. They have their own intelligence, their own purpose, their own fierce insistence on being recognized and integrated. They rise from the unconscious like ancient gods demanding sacrifice, like forgotten children demanding attention, like exiled aspects of the self demanding homecoming, and they will not be denied. The wrestling takes many forms, appears in many guises, speaks through many voices. Sometimes it is the complex of the unlived life, the artist you never became, the lover you never allowed yourself to be, the adventurer you sacrificed on the altar of security and respectability. This complex appears in dreams of flying, in sudden urges to quit your job and travel to distant places, in the inexplicable sadness that rises when you see others living with a freedom you have taught yourself not to want. Sometimes it is the complex of the wounded child, the aspect of your nature that never received the love it needed, never felt truly safe, never learned to trust in its own worthiness. This complex speaks through the voice of need that you have learned to silence, the longing for connection that you have dressed up as independence, the fear of abandonment that masquerades as self-sufficiency. It appears in your dreams as the lost child you must rescue, in your relationships as the insatiable hunger for reassurance, in your professional life as the perfectionism that can never quite prove you deserve to exist. Sometimes it is the complex of the unlived shadow, the destroyer, the rebel, the one who says no when yes is expected, who breaks what others build, who questions what others accept without examination. This complex rises when conformity becomes a prison, when niceness becomes a straitjacket, when the price of belonging becomes too high for the authentic self to pay. It appears in sudden surges of anger that seem to come from nowhere, in the urge to speak truths that will disturb the peace, in the inexplicable attraction to chaos when order becomes sterile and life-denying. Each complex that rises to wrestle with you carries a piece of the wholeness you have been seeking through partial means. The unlived life complex carries your creative fire, your authentic passion, the wild energy that has been domesticated into acceptable forms. The wounded child complex carries your capacity for genuine intimacy, your need for nurturing connection, the tender vulnerability that is the foundation of all love. The shadow complex carries your power, your ability to say no, your fierce protection of what is sacred and true within you. But integration is not a gentle process of polite conversation and mutual understanding. It is wrestling, the full body, all-night life or death grappling that Jacob experienced by the river. The autonomous complexes do not simply present themselves for inspection and conscious assimilation. They demand recognition through symptoms, through projections, through the autonomous behaviors that seem to arise from some force beyond conscious control. You find yourself acting in ways that surprise you, speaking words you didn't plan to speak, feeling emotions that don't fit your self-image. The careful persona you have constructed begins to crack under the pressure of forces that will no longer be contained by its narrow definitions. The person you thought you were, kind, rational, in control, reveals itself to be only one aspect of a much more complex and contradictory nature. This is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the wrestling, the discovery that you are not who you thought you were, that your identity has been built on a foundation of selective self-awareness, that the unconscious contains not only forgotten memories and repressed experiences, but also unlived possibilities, unrealized potentials, aspects of your nature that have been waiting in the wings for their moment to step onto the stage of consciousness. The angel of the unconscious is patient but relentless. It will not be satisfied with partial recognition, with intellectual understanding, with good intentions, to work on yourself at some future date. It demands embodied integration, lived reality, the actual transformation that occurs when consciousness expands to include what it has previously excluded. And this transformation cannot be accomplished through thinking alone. It requires the full engagement of your being, emotional, physical, spiritual, in the wrestling match that will remake you from the inside out. The battlefield of this wrestling is not abstract psychological space, but the concrete reality of your daily life. The complex of the unlived life demands expression not in therapy sessions, but in the actual choices you make about how to spend your time, your energy, your attention. The wounded child complex seeks healing not through understanding, but through the risk of genuine vulnerability in real relationships with real people. The shadow complex requires integration, not through acceptance of an idea, but through the embodied owning of your power, your anger, your capacity to disrupt and destroy what no longer serves life. And so the wrestling spills over from the inner sanctum of private reflection into the messy arena of lived experience. Relationships become the dojo where you practice new forms of intimacy and boundaries. Work becomes the laboratory where you experiment with expressing previously hidden aspects of your nature. Creative expression becomes the medium through which unlived aspects of the self find voice and form. The wrestling match with the angel of the unconscious transforms every area of your life into a training ground for greater wholeness. But this transformation is not without its casualties. The wrestling demands the death of your carefully curated partial self, the identity you have invested so much energy in maintaining. The successful persona that has served you well must crack to allow space for the fuller expression of your nature. The righteous stance that has given you moral certainty must crumble to make room for the complex ambiguity of lived truth. The familiar patterns of being that have provided security must dissolve to create space for the unknown possibilities that seek expression through you. This death of the partial self is experienced as genuine loss, genuine grief, genuine terror. Who will you be if you are not the person you have always believed yourself to be? What will remain if the structure of identity you have built so carefully is allowed to crumble? How will others recognize you, love you, relate to you if you become someone fundamentally different from who they have known? These questions have no answers that the rational mind can provide in advance. They can only be answered through the living of them, through the willingness to enter the wrestling match without knowing the outcome, without guarantees that you will emerge intact or recognizable. The angel of the unconscious offers no promises, no reassurances, no comfort for the ego's need to know and control. It offers only the invitation to wholeness, which is also an invitation to the unknown. Yet in this very uncertainty lies the seed of liberation. The wrestling match with the autonomous forces of the unconscious is simultaneously a wrestling match with the limitations of conscious control, with the illusion that you can manage your way to authenticity, that you can think your way to wholeness. The angel teaches through engagement, through the full-body experience of grappling with forces that are older, deeper, and more intelligent than the ego's strategies for staying safe. As the wrestling continues through the long night of transformation, you begin to recognize something that changes everything. Your greatest opponent may also be your deepest teacher. The complex that seems so threatening, so disruptive to your carefully ordered life, carries within it the very qualities you most need to develop. The shadow that you have fought so hard to keep at bay contains the power you need to stand in. Your truth, the wounded child that seems so needy and inconvenient, carries the capacity for the authentic intimacy your soul craves. The unlived life that seems so impractical and dangerous contains the creative fire that could transform not only your own existence, but your contribution to the world. This recognition does not end the wrestling, but it transforms its quality. What began as combat becomes collaboration, though a collaboration so intense, so demanding, that it still feels like wrestling. You are no longer fighting against the autonomous forces of your own nature, but working with them to birth a new form of consciousness, a new way of being that can hold the fullness of who you are without splitting into partial representations. The angel begins to reveal its true nature as this integration deepens. It is not the enemy of your conscious will, but its necessary completion. It carries not the destruction of your identity, but its expansion. It brings not chaos, but a more complex form of order, one that can include paradox, ambiguity, the dynamic tension of holding opposites in creative relationship. The wrestling teaches you that transformation is not a gentle unfolding, but an active, engaged process that requires everything you have to give. It teaches you that wholeness is not a static state of peaceful completion, but a dynamic process of ongoing integration. It teaches you that the unconscious is not a repository of forgotten experiences, but a living, creative force that continues to generate new possibilities for growth and expression. And it teaches you that the deepest spiritual work is not about transcending your human nature, but about embracing it fully, including the aspects that seem dark, difficult, or inconvenient to the ego's preferences. The angel of the unconscious carries the message that your divinity is not separate from your humanity, but expresses itself through the complete acceptance and integration of all that you are. As dawn approaches in this metaphorical night of wrestling, you find yourself changed in ways that cannot be undone. Like Jacob, you bear the mark of the encounter, not a wound exactly, but a permanent alteration that serves as a reminder of the night when you faced the autonomous forces of your own depths and discovered them to be not enemies, but teachers, not obstacles but gateways to a more complete form of consciousness. The angel blesses you with a new name, a new identity that can hold the fullness of who you have become through this wrestling. This blessing is not granted as a reward for victory, but as recognition of your willingness to engage, to risk everything you thought you knew about yourself, to allow transformation to occur through the complete engagement of your being with the mysterious forces that move through the depths of the psyche. And in this blessing, you understand that the wrestling was never about defeating the angel, but about allowing yourself to be defeated by it, to let it crack open the shell of partial identity and reveal the larger self that has been waiting to be born. The greatest enemy has indeed become the deepest teacher, and the teaching continues as you rise to meet the dawn of a new day, forever changed by the night of wrestling with the angel of the unconscious. The process of integration that follows. This wrestling is not a simple matter of conscious will applied to unconscious content. The autonomous complexes that have demanded recognition cannot be domesticated or managed in the same way that conscious attitudes and behaviors can be modified. They retain their autonomous nature even as they become integrated, continuing to function as semi-independent centers of consciousness that enrich and complicate the simple unity of ego consciousness. This is one of the most challenging aspects of psychological development, learning to live with the multiplicity of the psyche without splitting into dissociation or collapsing into identification with any single aspect of your nature. The wrestling with the angel teaches you to hold space for contradiction, to allow different aspects of your nature to coexist without demanding false resolution or premature synthesis. The person who emerges from this wrestling is not more unified, in the sense of being simpler or more consistent. If anything, they are more complex, more capable of holding paradox, more comfortable with the dynamic tensions that arise when consciousness expands to include previously excluded aspects of experience. They have learned to live with the angel as a permanent resident of the psyche, rather than an occasional visitor, to incorporate its wisdom into their daily decision-making without losing the capacity for rational thought and practical action. This integration manifests as a new form of strength, not the rigid strength of defensive walls, but the flexible strength of a tree that bends in the wind without breaking. It appears as a new form of authenticity, not the simple authenticity of expressing only what is comfortable, but the complex authenticity of expressing the fullness of your nature, including the aspects that create tension or conflict with external expectations. The wrestling teaches you that your task is not to become someone other than who you are, but to become more completely who you are, including the aspects of your nature that you have disowned, projected, or simply never recognized. It teaches you that the path to wholeness leads not around the difficult aspects of human nature, but directly through them, requiring you to claim and integrate what you would prefer to leave in the shadows. And so the wrestling with the angel of the unconscious becomes a template for all future encounters with the unknown aspects of yourself. You learn to recognize the signs of autonomous activity, to sense when a complex is beginning to constellation, to engage with these forces consciously rather than being possessed by them unconsciously. The wrestling becomes a form of active imagination, a conscious collaboration with the creative forces of the unconscious. The angel, once wrestled with and integrated, becomes an ally in the ongoing process of individuation. It teaches you to listen for the voice of the self that speaks through symptoms and projections, through dreams and synchronicities, through the autonomous activities that arise when consciousness becomes too narrow or rigid to accommodate the fullness of your nature. It becomes your inner guide to the territories of the psyche that lie beyond the ego's familiar domain. This is the blessing of the wrestling, not victory over the unconscious, but partnership with it, not the elimination of autonomous activity, but conscious collaboration with the forces that seek to express themselves through your life. You learn to dance with the angel rather than simply wrestling with it, to allow its wisdom to inform your choices while maintaining the capacity for conscious discrimination and ethical action. The wrestling never truly ends, but its quality continues to transform as consciousness develops the capacity to hold larger and more complex truths. New angels appear as you reach new levels of development. New autonomous complexes arise to demand integration as your capacity for wholeness expands. But having wrestled once with the angel of the unconscious, you know something that cannot be unlearned, that the forces that seem to oppose your conscious will are often the very forces that can liberate you from the limitations of that will. The night of wrestling by the river becomes a metaphor for the entire journey of individuation, the ongoing encounter with the autonomous forces of the psyche that demand recognition, integration, and conscious collaboration. Each wrestling match prepares you for the next, teaches you skills that will serve you in future encounters with the unknown aspects of yourself. And in the end, you understand that the angel was never your enemy, but your deepest friend, the force within your own nature that refused to let you remain partial, that insisted on wholeness even when wholeness seemed dangerous or impossible. The wrestling was the angel's gift to you, the opportunity to discover strengths you didn't know you had, to develop capacities you had never imagined, to become someone capable of holding the fullness of human experience without being destroyed by its complexity. As you carry the memory of that wrestling into your daily life, you become a different kind of person, not perfect, not without conflict or contradiction, but more real, more capable of genuine relationship with both the light and shadow aspects of existence. You have learned to wrestle with angels, and in learning this, you have learned something essential about what it means to be fully human in a world that offers both tremendous beauty and tremendous challenge. The angel has marked you, blessed you, given you a new name. You walk with a limp now, the sign of your encounter with forces greater than the ego's control. But you walk with strength too, the strength of someone who has faced the depths of their own nature and found there not an enemy to be defeated, but a teacher to be honored, a force to be reckoned with, an ally in the great work of becoming whole. The wrestling continues, will always continue, but you meet each new encounter with the knowledge that the angel of the unconscious is not separate from your deepest self, but is the voice of that self, calling you always toward greater wholeness, greater authenticity, greater capacity to embody the full spectrum of human possibility. And in this calling, you find not the burden of endless struggle, but the joy of endless growth, the satisfaction of engaging consciously with the creative forces that move through the depths of the psyche, shaping you always in the direction of your truest and most complete expression. The vessel cracks at dawn, not with the dramatic shattering you might expect from years of accumulated pressure, but with the almost inaudible sound of ceramic yielding to forces it can no longer contain. You wake to find fragments of who you thought you were, scattered across the landscape of consciousness like pieces of a broken mirror, each shard reflecting a different angle of a self you no longer recognize. This is the alchemical moment, the mystics spoke of in whispers, the nigredo, the blackening, the necessary dissolution that precedes all authentic transformation. The vessel of identity that has held your sense of self together for decades reveals itself to have been more fragile than you ever imagined, constructed not of the solid material you believed, but of crystallized assumptions, hardened habits, of perception, ossified beliefs about who you are and who you are supposed to become. The cracking begins subtly, often in the margins of ordinary experience. A compliment that once would have pleased you falls flat, meaningless. A criticism that would have devastated you yesterday seems to bounce off some invisible shield you didn't know you possessed. The roles that once defined you, the successful, professional, the devoted parent, the reliable friend, begin to feel like ill-fitting costumes worn for a play whose script you've suddenly forgotten. But the subtle fissures spread and deepen until the entire structure of identity becomes unstable. The persona, the carefully crafted public face you've worn for so long, it began to feel like your true nature, starts to slip and shift at the most inconvenient moments. In the middle of an important meeting, you catch yourself wondering why any of this matters. During a social gathering where you've always known exactly how to behave, you find yourself strangely mute, unable to access the familiar repertoire of responses that once flowed so effortlessly. This is enantiodromia, revealing itself in its most ruthless form, the inevitable swing of the pendulum that Jung observed as one of the fundamental laws of psychological life. Your greatest strengths, the qualities that have carried you through years of challenges and achievements, suddenly reveal themselves as your most binding limitations. The reliability that made you indispensable becomes the prison that prevents you from exploring new territories of being. The intelligence that served you so well in navigating complex situations becomes the obsessive analyzer that cannot rest in simple presence. The sensitivity that allowed you deep connection with others becomes the overwhelming responsiveness that leaves no room for your own authentic needs. The successful persona, that masterpiece of social adaptation you spent decades perfecting, becomes a straitjacket that prevents the authentic self from breathing. The righteous stance that gave you moral clarity and the satisfying certainty of knowing right from wrong becomes the rigid position that cannot bend to accommodate the complex ambiguities of lived truth. The familiar patterns of being that provided security and predictability become the repetitive loops that keep you trapped in a smaller version of yourself than your soul can tolerate. And so the vessel cracks, and then it shatters, and you find yourself standing in the ruins of an identity that no longer fits the reality of who you are becoming. The terror of this dissolution cannot be overstated. The ego, that organizing center of consciousness that has worked so hard to create a coherent sense of self, experiences this shattering as nothing less than death. And in a very real sense, it is death, the death of the partial self that has been masquerading as the whole self, the death of the carefully constructed identity that has been preventing the authentic self from emerging. But death of this kind is not the cessation of life, but its transformation. What dies is not your essential nature, but your identification with a limited version of that nature. What shatters is not your capacity for being, but your attachment to being someone particular, someone consistent, someone who can be easily categorized and understood by yourself and others. The fragments that remain after this shattering are not debris to be swept away, but pieces of a larger puzzle that was never completed because crucial elements were missing. The successful professional who lies broken at your feet was never false, only incomplete. The devoted parent whose identity can no longer contain the fullness of who you are was never wrong, only partial. The reliable friend whose consistency was both gift and limitation was never a mistake, only one movement in a symphony that requires other notes to achieve its full expression. But recognizing this intellectually provides little comfort when you are living through the actual experience of dissolution. The familiar landmarks of identity that once helped you navigate the complexities of existence have vanished, leaving you disoriented in a landscape that shifts and changes faster than consciousness can map. The internal compass that once pointed steadily toward your goals and values, spins wildly, unable to find true north in a reality that no longer conforms to your previous understanding of how things work. This disorientation extends to every aspect of experience. Relationships that once felt solid and predictable become mysterious and complex. Work that once provided meaning and purpose feels hollow and arbitrary. Values that once seemed absolute and unchanging reveal themselves as relative and contextual. The very foundations of reality seem to shift beneath your feet, leaving you wondering what, if anything, can be trusted as true and solid and real. The silence that emerges in the space between who you were and who you might become is unlike any silence you have ever experienced. It is not the peaceful quiet of meditation or the restful stillness of sleep. It is the pregnant silence of potential, charged with possibilities that your rational mind cannot yet comprehend. It is the silence of the void that exists before creation, the emptiness that is not the absence of something, but the presence of everything not yet manifest. In this silence, you taste the bitter freedom of having nothing left to lose. The attachments that once bound you to particular outcomes, particular ways of being, particular definitions of success and failure have been severed by the shattering of the vessel that contained them. The fears that once motivated your choices, fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of not being good enough, lose their power when there is no fixed self left to protect. This freedom is terrifying in its vastness. Without the familiar constraints of identity to define what is possible and what is not, anything becomes possible. Without the comfortable limitations of the persona to dictate appropriate behavior, any response becomes available. Without the reliable patterns of the ego to predict how you will react in any given situation, every moment becomes an encounter with the unknown. The terror and the freedom are inseparable, two faces of the same transformative process that is dissolving the boundaries between who you have been and who you might become. The vessel that is shattering contains not only the limitations you are being freed from, but also the security you are losing, not only the patterns that constrained you, but also the structures that provided stability and predictability. And so you find yourself suspended between worlds, no longer able to inhabit the old identity, but not yet able to perceive the new one that is trying to emerge. The familiar self feels like a costume that no longer fits, but the authentic self remains mysterious, revealing itself only in fragments, in moments of recognition that come and go too quickly to be grasped by the analyzing mind. This suspension is perhaps the most challenging aspect of the shattering, the requirement to live in uncertainty, to function in the world without the solid ground of fixed identity, to continue making choices and taking actions while experiencing yourself as fundamentally unknowable. The practical demands of life do not pause to accommodate your existential crisis. Bills still need to be paid. Relationships still require attention, work still demands your engagement. But the person who pays those bills, tends those relationships, and engages with that work is no longer the same person who took on those responsibilities. The vessel that held all these commitments together has cracked, and you must learn to function from a different center, to draw from resources you didn't know you possessed, to respond from depths that were previously hidden beneath the surface of social personality. This learning happens not through instruction, but through experimentation, not through understanding, but through practice. Each day becomes a laboratory for discovering what remains when the familiar structures of identity dissolve. Each interaction becomes an opportunity to explore new ways of being that are not constrained by the patterns of the past. Each challenge becomes a chance to access capacities that were unavailable as long as you remained identified with the partial self. Slowly, tentatively, you begin to discover that there is something that persists through the shattering, not a fixed identity, but a quality of presence, not a permanent self, but a continuous capacity for awareness, not a solid core, but a fluid center that can adapt to whatever circumstances arise. This something cannot be named or defined without immediately becoming another limitation, another partial identity to be transcended. It reveals itself not as a thing, but as a way of being, not as a possession, but as a process, not as an achievement, but as an ongoing creativity that responds freshly to each moment without being bound by the patterns of the past. It is the self that Jung distinguished from the ego, not another structure to be defended, but the organizing principle that can hold space for all the different aspects of your nature without being limited by any of them. The discovery of this deeper continuity does not immediately resolve the crisis of the shattered vessel. If anything, it deepens the mystery by revealing that your true nature is far more vast and complex than any identity could contain. The ego's desire for simplicity, for clear definition, for manageable categories is frustrated by the multifaceted reality of the self that includes contradictions and paradoxes that cannot be resolved through rational analysis. You find yourself capable of responses that surprise you, emotions that don't fit your self-image, thoughts that seem to arise from sources beyond your personal history. The predictable personality that others learn to expect from you gives way to something more spontaneous, more authentic, but also more challenging for those who prefer the security of knowing exactly who they are dealing with. Some relationships cannot survive this transformation. Friends who related to your persona find themselves confused by your authenticity. Family members who relied on your predictable patterns of response struggle to adapt to your new spontaneity. Professional colleagues who valued your consistency may find your growth threatening to their own fixed identities. The shattering of your vessel inevitably impacts the vessels of those around you. Your refusal to remain trapped in outdated patterns of being becomes an implicit challenge to their own limitations. Your willingness to risk the security of known identity for the adventure of authentic self-expression threatens the carefully maintained equilibrium of systems that depend on everyone staying in their assigned roles. This social dimension of the shattering adds another layer of complexity to the process. Not only must you navigate your own dissolution and reconstruction, but you must do so while managing the reactions of others who are disturbed by your transformation. The temptation to retreat into familiar patterns, to repair the vessel with the same materials that limited you before, becomes almost overwhelming when the alternative seems to be the loss of important relationships and social positions. But the authentic self, once glimpsed, cannot be unseen. The freedom tasted in the silence between identities cannot be forgotten. The vastness discovered beyond the boundaries of persona cannot be denied. Something in you has been awakened that will not go back to sleep. Something has been liberated that will not accept re-imprisonment. Something has been recognized that changes everything about how you understand your purpose and possibilities. And so you must learn to live in the tension between the old world that expects you to remain who you were and the new world that is calling you to become who you truly are. You must develop the capacity to honor the relationships and responsibilities that still have meaning while refusing to be limited by the identities those relationships and responsibilities once required. This learning to live in tension without resolution is perhaps one of the most sophisticated psychological skills that emerges from the shattering of the vessel. The either-or thinking that dominated the ego's approach to life gives way to both and consciousness that can hold paradox. Without demanding premature synthesis, you learn to be simultaneously responsible and free, committed and spontaneous, reliable and unpredictable. The fragments of the old identity do not disappear, but find new arrangements, new relationships with each other, and with aspects of your nature that were previously excluded from consciousness. The successful professional and the creative artist learn to dance together rather than competing for dominance. The devoted parent and the autonomous individual discover they can coexist without cancelling each other out. The reliable friend and the authentic truth-teller find ways to support rather than contradict each other. This reconfiguration happens not through conscious design, but through the organic wisdom of the self that knows how to organize multiplicity into dynamic harmony. Just as a jazz ensemble creates coherence through improvisation rather than rigid adherence to a predetermined score, your psyche learns to create unity through the dynamic interplay of different aspects of your nature, rather than through the suppression of everything that doesn't fit a narrow definition of acceptable selfhood. The vessel that emerges from this process is fundamentally different from the one that shattered. Where the old container was rigid, the new one is flexible. Where the old structure demanded consistency, the new one allows for growth and change. Where the old identity required the exclusion of contradictory elements, the new organization embraces paradox as a source of creativity and vitality. This new vessel is less like a ceramic pot and more like a living membrane, permeable, responsive, capable of expansion and contraction as circumstances require. It provides structure without rigidity, boundary without imprisonment, coherence without the sacrifice of complexity. It is strong enough to contain the fullness of your nature, but flexible enough to accommodate continued growth and transformation. The bitter freedom of having nothing left to lose gradually transforms into the sweet freedom of having everything to gain. The terror of the unknown gives way to excitement about possibilities that could never have been imagined from the perspective of the limited identity. The chaos of dissolution reveals itself to have been the fertile chaos of creativity, the necessary breakdown that precedes breakthrough. But this transformation is not a return to innocence or a recovery of some original wholeness that was merely obscured by the false structures of social conditioning. It is an evolution to a new level of complexity that includes and transcends everything that came before. The shattered vessel becomes compost for new growth, raw material for constructions that are more beautiful and more functional than anything that could have been achieved through mere repair. You emerge from this process not as someone who has returned to their true self, but as someone who has discovered that their true self is not a fixed entity to be found, but a creative process to be lived. The shattering reveals that identity is not something you have, but something you do. Not a possession to be defended, but a practice to be engaged. Not a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be explored. The silence between who you were and who you might become becomes pregnant with infinite possibility. In that silence, you hear not the absence of sound, but the presence of every sound not yet spoken. See not emptiness, but the fullness of potential waiting to manifest. Feel not the void, but the womb of new creation stirring with life. And in this recognition, the shattering of the vessel is revealed not as destruction, but as birth, not as ending, but as beginning, not as failure, but as the successful completion of one phase of development and the initiation into another. The broken pieces at your feet are not the debris of a life destroyed, but the raw materials of a life being reborn, not the evidence of your inadequacy, but the proof of your readiness for transformation beyond anything your previous identity could have imagined or contained. The vessel has shattered and you are free. Free to discover who you are beneath the layers of who you thought you were supposed to be. Free to explore territories of being that were inaccessible as long as you remained trapped in the familiar patterns of outdated identity. Free to create new forms of expression that honor both your depth and your spontaneity. both your wisdom and your capacity for surprise. This freedom is not the absence of constraint, but the presence of authentic constraint, boundaries that arise from your true nature rather than being imposed from external expectations, limitations that serve your growth rather than restricting it, structures that support your authenticity rather than demanding its sacrifice. In the end, you understand that the shattering was not something that happened to you, but something that happened through you, not a disaster that befell you, but a transformation that you participated in creating through your willingness to grow beyond the boundaries of who you had been. The vessel broke not because it was defective, but because it had served its purpose, and something larger was ready to be born. And so you stand in the ruins of your old identity, surrounded by the fragments of who you used to be, and you smile. Not because the process was easy or painless, but because you recognize in those scattered pieces the raw material for something magnificent, the compost from which new life will spring, the evidence that you are capable of transformation far more profound than you ever dared to imagine. The vessel has shattered, the silence is pregnant with possibility, and you are free to begin again, not from nothing, but from everything you have learned, everything you have become. Everything you are willing to discover about the vast mystery of your own authentic being. The freedom is bitter and sweet, terrifying and exhilarating, and it tastes exactly like the truth you have been seeking all along. The expulsion comes without ceremony, without the dramatic confrontation you might expect from so profound a banishment. One morning you simply wake to find yourself standing at the edge of a vast wilderness, the comfortable certainties of your former life receding behind you like a mirage that was never as solid as it appeared. The gates of Eden, that garden of assumed truths, inherited beliefs, and unquestioned certainties, have closed with a finality that reverberates through every cell of your being. This is not the Eden of biblical mythology, though that ancient story echoes through your experience with the resonance of eternal truth. This is the psychological Eden of unconscious participation in collective reality, the paradise of never having to question the fundamental assumptions that structure your world. It is the blessed state of innocent identification with the values, beliefs and purposes that your family, your culture, your society offered as unquestionable foundations for meaningful existence. In that Eden, you knew who you were because others told you. You knew what was true because authorities proclaimed it. You knew what mattered because tradition preserved it. The questions that might have disturbed this peaceful certainty were held at bay by the comforting weight of consensus, the reassuring presence of others who shared your assumptions and validated your understanding of how reality works. But Eden is not meant to be a permanent residence. The very forces that create paradise also make it a prison, trapping consciousness in a state of beautiful unconsciousness that prevents the full flowering of individual authentic awareness. The comfort of unquestioned certainty comes at the price of genuine autonomy, the security of inherited wisdom at the cost of personal discovery, the peace of consensus reality at the expense of intimate relationship with truth as you experience it directly. The exile begins subtly with small questions that arise you unbidden in moments of quiet reflection. Why do the answers that satisfy everyone else leave you feeling hollow? Why do the goals that motivate your peers seem increasingly meaningless to you? Why do the explanations that once provided comfort now feel like elaborate constructions designed to avoid more fundamental questions about the nature of existence, meaning, and purpose? These questions are the serpent in your personal Eden, the force that disrupts the innocent identification with received wisdom and initiates the long journey toward individual consciousness. At first, you try to silence them, to return to the blessed state of not knowing that you don't know, to recapture the security of living within ready-made meanings and purposes that require no personal authentication. But questions, once awakened, have their own life force. They grow stronger through attempts at suppression, more insistent through efforts to ignore them, more powerful through the very resistance they encounter. What begins as a whisper of doubt becomes a chorus of inquiry that drowns out the familiar voices of certainty, transforming your inner landscape from a peaceful garden into a battlefield where different versions of truth compete for your allegiance. The expulsion from Eden is not a punishment for some moral failing, but a necessary graduation from one stage of development to another. The comfort of unconscious participation in collective reality must be sacrificed for the possibility of conscious relationship with your own authentic truth. The security of borrowed meanings must be relinquished for the adventure of discovering meanings that arise from your direct encounter with existence, and so you find yourself cast out into the wilderness of questioning, where every assumed truth becomes sand beneath your feet, shifting with each step you take toward greater understanding. The solid ground of certainty gives way to the fluid terrain of inquiry, where nothing can be taken for granted and everything must be examined with fresh eyes, felt with an open heart, tested against the touchstone of your own lived experience. This wilderness is not empty, though it feels devastatingly lonely after the populated landscape of consensus reality. It is inhabited by forces and figures that were invisible as long as you remained within the protective boundaries of collective belief. Here, in this wasteland of the soul, the anima and animus emerge from the depths like mysterious guides who speak in riddles, offer contradictory advice, and lead you along paths that seem to circle back on themselves in endless spirals of deepening confusion. The anima, that mysterious feminine principle within the masculine psyche, appears first as a sense of something missing, something essential to your completeness, that cannot be found in the external achievements and rational understanding that Eden valued so highly. She speaks through the inexplicable longing that arises when you see beauty that serves no practical purpose, the irrational tears that come when music touches something deeper than thought, the sudden certainty that there is more to existence than can be measured, categorized, or explained. But the anima is not a gentle guide who leads you safely through the wilderness. She is as likely to lead you astray as to guide you home, to seduce you with impossible dreams as to inspire you with authentic vision. She appears in the form of the perfect love that will complete you, the ideal creative project that will fulfill you, the spiritual experience that will finally answer all your questions and restore the peace you lost when you left Eden behind. These anima projections become mirages in the desert of questioning, shimmering promises of restoration that disappear when approached directly, leaving you more lost and thirsty than before. The woman who seemed to embody everything you needed for completeness reveals herself to be as complex and contradictory as you are. The creative vision that promised to give your life ultimate meaning transforms into another burden of expectations that cannot be fulfilled. The spiritual path that seemed to offer final answers opens into deeper questions that challenge everything you thought you had learned. The animus, that mysterious masculine principle within the feminine psyche, appears as the voice of authority that promises to restore order to the chaos of wilderness wandering. He speaks with the conviction of someone who has found the answers you seek, who knows the way forward, who can provide the structure and direction that will end your confusion and return you to a state of blessed certainty. But the animus, the anima, is both guide and deceiver, offering premature closure to questions that require living rather than solving, imposing false clarity on mysteries that must be inhabited rather than understood. He appears as the guru who has all the answers, the system of thought that explains everything, the ideology that promises to make sense of the senseless complexity of human existence. These animus projections become oases of false certainty in the desert of not knowing, intellectual constructions that provide temporary relief from the discomfort of genuine inquiry, but ultimately prove as insubstantial as any other mirage. The teacher who seemed to embody ultimate wisdom reveals himself to be as limited and human as any other. The philosophical system that promised complete understanding crumbles when applied to the irreducible complexity of lived experience. The ideology that offered absolute certainty becomes another prison that must be escaped through further questioning. And so you learn that not all who wander are lost, though the distinction between wandering and being lost often remains unclear, until long after the journey is complete. The aimless circling that seems like evidence of failure gradually reveals itself as a necessary process of exploration, a way of becoming familiar with the wilderness that cannot be mapped in advance or navigated through the application of rules. Learned in Eden, the wilderness has its own geography, its own weather patterns, its own seasons and rhythms that bear no resemblance to the cultivated landscape you left behind. Here, progress cannot be measured in straight lines or quantified achievements. Here, success often looks like failure from the perspective of Eden's values, and failure often contains the seeds of breakthroughs that would have been impossible. Within the protective boundaries of consensus reality, you learn to navigate not by the false lights of collective consensus, those artificial illuminations that seem so bright and reliable when seen from Eden, but by the subtle guidance of your own authentic responses to whatever you encounter. A thought that generates genuine excitement rather than dutiful compliance. A direction that calls to something deeper than rational planning. A possibility that resonates with frequencies you didn't know you could perceive. This learning to trust your own authentic responses is perhaps the most challenging aspect of wilderness wandering. Eden taught you to look outside yourself for guidance, to validate your perceptions against the standards of others, to question your own experience when it contradicted established authorities. The wilderness demands the opposite. It requires you to develop confidence in your own capacity for discernment, to trust the subtle signals that arise from depths beyond rational analysis, to follow the thread of your authentic interest, even when it leads away from paths that others recommend. But authenticity, you discover, is not a simple matter of following impulses or doing whatever feels good in the moment. The wilderness teaches discrimination between the voice of authentic wisdom and the voices of unhealed wounds, between the call of genuine possibility and the siren song of compensatory fantasies. Learning this discrimination requires time, patience, and the willingness to make mistakes that cannot be undone, to follow false leads to their inevitable disappointing conclusions, to experience the full consequences of choices made from partial understanding. The mistakes become teachers, as valuable as any success. The false leads reveal aspects of the terrain that would have remained hidden if you had stayed on approved paths. The disappointing conclusions of compensatory fantasies clear away illusions that would have continued to obstruct authentic development. In the wilderness, failure is not the opposite of success, but another form of learning, another way of gathering information about the mysterious landscape you are exploring. Gradually, very gradually, you begin to recognize patterns in the wilderness that are invisible to those who remain in Eden. The seemingly random events that befall you reveal themselves as meaningful coincidences, synchronicities that suggest a hidden order operating beneath the surface chaos of dissolution and questioning. The people who appear at crucial moments in your journey turn out to carry exactly the medicine you need, even when they seem to bring only conflict or confusion. The obstacles that block your preferred path force detours that lead to discoveries. you would never have made by following your original plans. This recognition of hidden order does not restore the simple certainties of Eden, but it does provide a different kind of orientation in the wilderness, not the security of knowing where you are going, but the confidence that you are going somewhere, that the journey itself has meaning and direction, even when that meaning and direction remain mysterious to your rational understanding. The anima and animus, those internal guides who first appeared as projections onto external figures, gradually reveal their true nature as aspects of your own psyche seeking integration. The anima's gift is not the perfect external love that will complete you, but the development of your own capacity for discernment, structure, focused intention, in service of authentic values. But integration of these inner figures is not accomplished through understanding alone. It requires lived experience, embodied practice, the willingness to experiment with ways of being that feel foreign to the personality structures developed in Eden. The man who has lived primarily through rational analysis must risk opening to the non-rational wisdom of feeling and intuition. The woman who has defined herself through relationship and receptivity must risk developing the focused autonomy of individual will and decision. This experimentation often feels like betrayal of everything you once valued about yourself. Rational man who begins to trust intuitive hunches experiences himself as becoming flaky, unreliable, potentially deluded. The relational woman who begins to assert her own needs and boundaries experiences herself as becoming selfish, demanding, potentially destructive to the harmony she once prioritized above all else. But these experiences of betraying your old self are necessary stages in the development of a more complete identity. The rational man who integrates intuitive capacity becomes more effective rather than less, capable of accessing information and making decisions from a broader range of sources. The relational woman who develops autonomous capacity becomes more genuinely available for relationship rather than less, no longer dependent on others for her sense of identity and worth. The wilderness wandering teaches you that authenticity is not found by returning to some original self that existed before socialization corrupted your natural responses. That self never existed. Consciousness develops through relationship with others, through participation in culture, through the very processes of adaptation that Eden represented. What you are seeking is not recovery of an original nature, but evolution to a more complex form of consciousness that can include both individual authenticity and meaningful participation in collective life. This evolution requires learning to live with paradox, to hold tensions that cannot be resolved through either-or thinking. You must learn to be simultaneously independent and interdependent, self-reliant and responsive to guidance, confident in your own perceptions, and humble before the vastness of what you do not understand. The wilderness strips away the illusion that such paradoxes can be resolved through clever thinking or spiritual practices, revealing them instead as fundamental characteristics of mature consciousness. The stars that become your guides in this wilderness navigation are not external authorities, but internal values that emerge from your direct encounter with existence. These values cannot be borrowed from others or inherited from tradition. They must be discovered through the lived experience of exploring what truly matters to you when stripped of social expectations and inherited assumptions. This discovery process is often messy and non-linear. Values that seem clear and compelling in one season of your journey prove inadequate or even counterproductive in another. Principles that served you well during earlier stages of development become rigid, limitations that must be transcended for further growth. The very capacity to generate authentic values turns out to be more important than any particular set of values you might adopt. You learn to hold your own discoveries lightly, with the recognition that growth requires the continuous willingness to outgrow previous versions of truth and authenticity. What feels like ultimate realization at one stage of development reveals itself as partial understanding from the perspective of later stages. The wilderness teaches humility before the mystery of existence, respect for the complexity that cannot be captured in any final formulation, but this humility is not the passive humility of the helpless creature before an incomprehensible universe. It is the active humility of the conscious participant in an ongoing creative process that includes your own agency as one of its essential elements. You are not simply wandering randomly in the wilderness, you are exploring it, mapping it through. Your experience, contributing to its ongoing evolution through your conscious engagement with whatever you encounter. The relationship between individual consciousness and the larger patterns of existence reveals itself as a dance rather than a hierarchy. You are not a separate being trying to figure out an external reality, but a unique expression of universal consciousness exploring itself through the particular lens of your individual perspective. Your authentic responses to whatever you encounter are not mere personal preferences, but information that the universe is gathering about its own nature and possibilities. This recognition transforms the quality of wilderness, wandering from exile to exploration, from punishment to privilege, from loss to adventure. You are not lost. You are discovering territories of being that were inaccessible from the perspective of Eden's certainties. You are not wandering aimlessly. You are following the subtle guidance of authentic interest and response toward discoveries that will enrich not only your own understanding, but the collective understanding of what it means to be human. The stars of authentic values that guide you through the wilderness are not static points of reference, but living lights that grow brighter as you follow them, more complex as your capacity to perceive them develops, more beautiful as your appreciation for their nature deepens. They lead you not to a destination that can be reached and possessed, but to an ongoing relationship with mystery that continues to unfold throughout your lifetime. And gradually, very gradually, you begin to understand that the wilderness is not a place you will eventually leave behind, but a way of being that you are learning to inhabit with ever greater skill and appreciation. The uncertainty that once felt like a problem to be solved reveals itself as the condition that makes growth possible. The questioning that once felt like a burden to be resolved becomes the creative force that keeps consciousness alive and developing. You learn to love the wilderness not because it is comfortable, it will never be as comfortable as Eden, but because it is real, because it offers the possibility of genuine relationship with existence rather than merely inherited relationship with ideas about existence. The false lights of collective consensus, those artificial illuminations that seemed so reliable from Eden, are revealed as pale reflections of the authentic guidance that emerges when you learn to navigate by the stars of your own deepest values and responses. The anima and animus, those mysterious inner others who first appeared as projections and confusions, become trusted allies in the ongoing exploration of the wilderness. They no longer promise to lead you back to Eden or forward to some new paradise, but they offer the companionship of your own deeper nature as you learn to make your home in the vast landscape of consciousness that opens when the boundaries of consensus reality can no longer contain your expanding awareness. In the end, you discover that the wilderness was never a punishment for leaving Eden, but a graduation to a more mature form of existence, one that includes the capacity to create meaning rather than merely inherit it, to generate values rather than simply adopt them, to participate consciously in the ongoing evolution of consciousness rather than remaining a passive recipient of predetermined truths. The journey continues, will always continue, but you walk now with the confidence of someone who has learned to navigate by authentic guidance rather than borrowed authority, someone who has discovered that the wilderness is not a wasteland to be endured, but a vast field of possibility to be explored, someone who knows that not all who wander are lost. Some are simply learning to find their way by the light of their own authentic star. Close your eyes for a moment. Feel the weight of your body, the rhythm of your breathing, the gentle pulse of consciousness flowing through your mind. You are here, now, experiencing this singular moment of existence. But what if I told you that this moment, this very experience of being you, is just one thread in an infinite tapestry of reality? What if the you that exists in this instant is simultaneously living countless other lives, making different choices, experiencing alternate histories, all playing out in parallel? Universes that branch away from this moment, like rivers flowing from a single source. This is not science fiction. This is quantum mechanics taken to its most profound and unsettling conclusion. In the quantum world, reality doesn't follow the neat, predictable paths that our everyday experience suggests. When physicists peer into the atomic realm, they discover something so strange, so fundamentally at odds with our intuitions, that it has taken nearly a century to even begin to grapple with its implications. At the quantum level, particles don't have definite properties until they're measured. They exist in what scientists call superposition, a ghostly state where all possible outcomes exist simultaneously, overlapping like waves on a pond. Imagine for a moment flipping a coin. In our everyday experience, the coin is either heads or tails from the moment it leaves your thumb. But in the quantum realm, that coin would be both heads and tails, spinning in a probabilistic haze of potential outcomes until the moment it lands and reality chooses which possibility becomes real. This is the measurement problem, the deeply puzzling question of how and why quantum superpositions collapse into definite outcomes when observed. For decades, physicists struggled with this paradox. How does the universe decide which possibility becomes reality? What special property does measurement possess that forces quantum systems to choose? The orthodox interpretation, developed by Niels Bohr and Werner Heisenberg in the 1920s, suggested that measurement somehow causes the wave function, the mathematical description of quantum possibilities, to collapse into a single outcome. But this explanation always felt incomplete, almost magical in its invocation of consciousness or measurement apparatus as the arbiters of reality. Then, in 1957, a young physicist named Hugh Everett III proposed a solution so radical, so mind-bending in its implications that it would fundamentally change how we think about the nature of existence itself. What if, Everett asked, the wave function never actually collapses? What if all possible outcomes of every quantum event actually occur, but in separate parallel branches of reality? This is the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, and it suggests something extraordinary about the nature of your existence. Every quantum event, every photon that strikes your retina, every electron that jumps between energy levels in your neurons, every random decay of atomic nuclei in your cells doesn't just create one outcome. It creates all possible outcomes, each in its own parallel universe. And in each of these universes, a slightly different version of you continues to exist, experiencing a reality that diverged from your own at the quantum level. Right now, as you process these words, countless quantum events are occurring throughout your body. In your brain, neurotransmitters are crossing synapses in patterns that depend on quantum processes. In your cells, chemical reactions are proceeding along pathways determined by quantum mechanical probabilities. Each of these events represents a branching point, a moment where reality splits into multiple paths. In one universe, a particular quantum event in your visual cortex unfolds one way, and you interpret these words with a certain emotional resonance. In another universe, that same event unfolds differently, and the you in that reality experiences these concepts with a subtly different understanding. In yet another universe, quantum fluctuations in your neurons create a cascade of thoughts that leads you to pause reading and contemplate the stars outside your window. All of these versions of you are equally real, equally valid, equally alive, but forever separated by the branching structure of quantum reality. The mathematical elegance of the many worlds interpretation is both beautiful and terrifying. It eliminates the need for wave function collapse by suggesting that collapse never actually happens. Instead, what we experience as the collapse of quantum possibilities into definite outcomes is simply our consciousness becoming entangled with one branch of the ever-branching tree of reality. We don't see the other branches because we can't. Our consciousness is trapped within a single thread of the infinite web, unable to perceive the vast multiplicity of existence that surrounds us. Consider the quantum events happening in your brain at this very moment. Each neuron in your cerebral cortex contains billions of atoms, each governed by quantum mechanical laws. The thoughts you're thinking, the memories you're accessing, the emotions you're feeling, all of these emerge from patterns of neural activity that depend, at their most fundamental level, on quantum processes. And according to the many worlds interpretation, every possible pattern of quantum events in your brain is actually occurring, each in its own parallel reality. This means that there are versions of you where your thoughts took a different path. Just moments ago, perhaps in one universe you decided to skip this section and jump ahead. In another, you paused to make a cup of tea. In yet another, a different pattern of quantum events in your memory centers caused you to recall a childhood experience that changed the entire trajectory of your thoughts. Each of these alternate yous is living out their reality with the same sense of continuity and identity that you feel in this moment. But the implications go deeper still. If every quantum event creates branching realities, then the history of your life is not a single linear story. It's an ever-expanding tree of possibilities, with each branch representing a path your life could have taken based on different quantum outcomes. There are versions of you where quantum tunneling events in your DNA led to slightly different genetic expressions, creating subtle changes in your personality or abilities. There are realities where quantum fluctuations affected the neural development of your fetal brain, leading to different patterns of thinking and creativity. The branching extends beyond your personal history to encompass the entire cosmos. There are universes where quantum events in the early universe unfolded differently, leading to slightly different physical constants, different distributions of matter, different evolutionary paths. Some of these universes might be so similar to ours that the differences are imperceptible. Others might be radically different, realities where the laws of physics themselves took alternate forms based on different quantum outcomes in the first moments after the Big Bang. In some of these parallel realities, versions of you never came into existence at all. Perhaps quantum events during your parents' courtship unfolded differently and they never met. Perhaps random mutations in your ancestors' DNA took evolution down a different path. But in countless other realities, versions of you not only exist, but have lived lives that diverge from your own in ways both subtle and profound. There's a version of you who made different choices, not because of free will or conscious decision-making, but because quantum events in your brain created different patterns of thought at crucial moments. There's a you who moved to a different city, pursued a different career, fell in love with a different person, all because of quantum fluctuations that nudged your neurons toward alternate patterns of activity. These alternate selves aren't hypothetical or imaginary. According to the many worlds interpretation, they're as real and vivid as the you experiencing this moment. The strangest aspect of this infinite branching is that each version of you experiences their reality as the only reality. The you reading these words feels like the real you, just as every alternate version feels equally real to themselves. There's no privileged perspective, no central timeline from which all others diverge. Each branch of reality is complete and self-contained, populated by conscious beings who experience their world as solid, continuous, and singular. This multiplicity of selves raises profound questions about the nature of identity and consciousness. Are you a single, continuous being experiencing one linear existence? Or are you a vast, branching entity spread across infinite realities, with each branch experiencing a different slice of your potential existence? From the perspective of the many worlds interpretation, your consciousness is not a single stream, but a delta, a vast network of experiential threads, each carrying the sensation of being the real you. The mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics supports this mind-bending vision of reality. The wave function that describes quantum systems contains all possible outcomes simultaneously, awaited by their respective probabilities. In the many worlds interpretation, these aren't just abstract mathematical possibilities, they're real, physical branches of existence. The universe isn't probabilistic because we don't know which outcome will occur. It's probabilistic because all outcomes do occur, and we only experience one of them. But perhaps the most unsettling implication of the many worlds interpretation is what it suggests about the choices you make and the life you lead. Every decision you face, every path you choose, is simultaneously taken and not taken across the infinite branches of quantum reality. The career you didn't pursue, the person you didn't marry, the words you didn't speak, all of these alternatives are being lived out by other versions of you in parallel universes. This doesn't diminish the meaning or significance of your choices in this reality. The experiences you have, the relationships you build, the impact you make, these remain profoundly real and meaningful within the branch of existence you inhabit. But it does suggest that your life is part of a much vaster story, a cosmic epic, in which every possible human experience is being lived out simultaneously across the infinite expanse of the multiverse. As you contemplate this vision of reality, consider the quantum events occurring in your brain at this very moment. Electrons are tunneling between energy states in your neurons. Photons are being absorbed and emitted in the complex chemistry of consciousness. Each of these events represents a branching point, a moment where your reality splits into multiple possible futures. In some of these futures, you'll remember this moment as a turning point in your understanding of existence. In others, you'll forget these words by tomorrow. In yet others, the quantum events in your brain will lead you down entirely different paths of thought and experience. All of these futures are equally real, equally valid, equally you. The many worlds interpretation offers a solution to the measurement problem by eliminating measurement altogether. There's no mysterious collapse of the wave function, no special role for consciousness or observation in determining reality. Instead, there's simply the endless branching of possibilities, with each branch containing conscious observers who experience their reality as the only reality. It's a solution that preserves the mathematical consistency of quantum me. mechanics while suggesting a universe far stranger and more magnificent than we ever imagined. You are not alone in this moment. Across the infinite branches of quantum reality, countless versions of you are sharing similar experiences, each feeling the same sense of being the singular, authentic you. Together, you form a vast, multidimensional being, a quantum consciousness spread across the endless expanse of parallel worlds, experiencing every possible permutation of existence simultaneously. This is the deepest implication of quantum mechanics. You are not a single story, but an infinite library of stories. You are not one person, but every person you could possibly be. You are not living one life, but all possible lives scattered across the boundless landscape of quantum possibility. And in this moment, as these words reach your consciousness, you are connecting with just one thread in the magnificent, terrifying, beautiful tapestry of your quantum existence. There is a secret hidden in plain sight, woven into the very fabric of your existence. You think of yourself as solid, substantial, made of flesh and bone, and the accumulated matter of a lifetime. You feel the weight of your body, the resistance of your chair, the texture of the air flowing through your lungs. But this solidity is an illusion, perhaps the most profound and beautiful illusion in all of existence. You are not made of particles. You are not composed of tiny, discrete chunks of matter bouncing against each other like cosmic billiard balls. You are something far more mysterious and elegant. You are a pattern of dancing energy in invisible fields that permeate every cubic centimeter of space, a symphony played by forces so fundamental that they existed before the birth of stars and will persist long after the last black hole evaporates into the quantum foam. This is the revelation of quantum field theory, one of the most successful and counterintuitive frameworks in all of physics. It tells us that what we think of as particles, electrons, photons, quarks, neutrinos, are not really particles at all. They are excitations, vibrations, waves of potential energy rippling through underlying fields that fill the universe. Imagine the surface of a perfectly still pond. Now imagine that pond extending not just horizontally, but through all three dimensions of space. And then imagine that this three-dimensional pond is actually 11-dimensional, curving through geometries that your mind cannot visualize. This is closer to the true nature of reality. You live immersed in an ocean of invisible fields, and everything you perceive as solid matter is simply the result of these fields vibrating in particular patterns. The electron field spreads throughout all of space, humming with potential. When this field vibrates in just the right way, when it reaches certain energy thresholds, it creates what we perceive as an electron, a localized excitation that appears to have mass, charge, and spin. But the electron is no more separate from the electron field than a wave is separate from the ocean. The wave is the ocean, temporarily arranged in a particular pattern. The electron is the field, temporarily organized into a stable configuration that persists long enough to participate in the chemistry of atoms, the biology of cells, the neurobiology of consciousness. Right now, your body contains approximately 7 octillion atoms, a number so large that if you counted 1 atom per second, it would take you longer than the age of the universe to finish. Each of these atoms is composed of protons, neutrons, and electrons, which in turn are manifestations of underlying quantum fields. The protons in your DNA are excitations in the up and down quark fields, held together by excitations in the gluon field. The electrons flowing through your neurons are waves in the electron field, their movement guided by excitations in the electromagnetic field. You are not a collection of particles, but a complex, ever-changing pattern in the universal field system, a temporary arrangement of energy that has learned to perceive itself. But the fields extend far beyond the matter that comprises your body. They permeate the seemingly empty space around you, the vacuum between your atoms, the vast distances between planets and stars. What you think of as empty space is actually seething with activity, filled with virtual particles that constantly pop into existence and annihilate themselves before they can be directly observed. These virtual particles are real, not in the sense that they persist long enough to be measured individually, but in the sense that their collective behavior has measurable effects on the world around you. The Casimir effect demonstrates this quantum reality in a way that's both elegant and profound. When two metal plates are placed very close together in a vacuum, they experience a tiny, attractive force, not because of any classical interaction, but because the quantum fields between the plates are restricted in their vibrations. The space between the plates can only support certain wavelengths of virtual particle fluctuations, while the space outside the plates can support a full spectrum of quantum foam. This creates a pressure difference, a measurable force generated by the constrained activity of fields in what appears to be empty space. You live surrounded by this quantum foam, immersed in a sea of virtual particles that flash in and out of existence trillions of times per second, their brief lives contributing to the fundamental forces that hold your atoms together and govern the behavior of matter and energy throughout the universe. The electromagnetic field that surrounds you is perhaps the most familiar of these invisible presences. Every photon that strikes your retina, every radio wave that passes through your body, every X-ray that might reveal your bones, these are all excitations in the same underlying field. The field itself is massless, chargeless, timeless. It existed in the first moments after the Big Bang, when the universe was nothing but a hot, dense soup of energy and possibility. It will persist long after the last stars burn out and the cosmos expands into cold, dark emptiness. The field is eternal, but its excitations, the photons that carry light and energy through the universe, are temporary patterns, messages written in the language of electromagnetic vibration. When you look at a star, the photons entering your eyes began their journey decades, centuries, or millennia ago as excitations in the electromagnetic field surrounding that distant sun. They traveled across the vast emptiness of space, maintaining their coherent patterns through cosmic time, until they reached the electromagnetic field that permeates your visual cortex and triggered cascades of neural activity that your consciousness interprets as starlight. The star you see is not the star as it exists now. It's a pattern of electromagnetic field excitations that has been traveling toward you through space and time, a message encoded in light that tells the story of fusion reactions that occurred when your ancestors were living very different lives, or perhaps before they existed at all. But perhaps the most mysterious of all the quantum fields is the Higgs field, which permeates every corner of the universe and gives mass to the particles that compose your body. Before the discovery of the Higgs boson at the Large Hadron Collider, this field was purely theoretical, a necessary component of the standard model of particle physics, but one that had never been directly observed. The field itself is invisible, intangible, impossible to detect directly, but its effects are everywhere. It's why electrons have mass, why protons are heavier than neutrons, why the atoms in your body don't simply fly apart at the speed of light. Imagine walking through thick honey. The honey resists your movement, making each step require more energy than it would in empty air. The Higgs field works similarly, but instead of resisting movement through space, it resists acceleration. Particles that interact strongly with the Higgs field acquire mass. They become harder to accelerate, more resistant to changes in motion. Particles that don't interact with the Higgs field, like photons, remain massless and travel at the speed of light. The mass of your body, the weight you feel when you stand on a scale, the inertia you experience when you change direction, is actually a measure of how strongly the particles that compose you interact with this invisible, omnipresent field. The key, Higgs field, has a unique property that sets it apart from all other known fields. It has a non-zero value even in its lowest energy state. Most fields, when they reach their ground state, simply disappear. Their energy drops to zero and they become undetectable. But the Higgs field maintains a constant, uniform background value throughout the universe. This means that even in the deepest vacuum, in the emptiest regions of intergalactic space, the Higgs field is there, humming with potential, ready to interact with any particle that passes through it. This constant background presence of the Higgs field raises profound questions about the nature of vacuum itself. What we think of as empty space is actually filled with the Higgs field at its vacuum expectation value, a kind of cosmic background energy that pervades all of existence. Some physicists speculate that this energy might not represent the true ground state of the universe. Perhaps there's a lower energy configuration that the Higgs field could adopt, and our entire universe exists in what's called a false vacuum, a temporarily stable state that could, in principle, decay to a lower energy level. If this decay were ever to occur, if the Higgs field were to suddenly shift to a lower energy state, it would fundamentally alter the laws of physics throughout the universe. Particles would acquire different masses, atoms would become unstable. The chemistry that makes life possible would cease to function. This transition would spread outward at the speed of light from its point of origin, creating an expanding bubble of altered physics that would eventually encompass the entire observable universe. Everything you know, everything you are, would be transformed into something unrecognizable, not destroyed, but translated into a completely different physical reality, governed by different rules and constants. But this possibility, however remote, points to something profound about your existence. You are not just made of matter and energy arranged in complex patterns. You are made of the relationships between fields, the delicate balance of forces and interactions that allows particles to exist, atoms to form, molecules to assemble into the intricate structures of life. You exist because the electromagnetic field and the strong nuclear force are balanced in just the right way to allow atomic nuclei to hold together. You exist because the weak nuclear force operates at just the right strength to allow stars to burn hydrogen into heavier elements. You exist because the Higgs field gives particles just the right masses to allow chemistry to work, biology to emerge, consciousness to arise. The quantum fields that compose your being are not separate entities competing for space. They overlap, interpenetrate, influence each other through complex interactions that physicists are still working to understand. When an electron in your brain absorbs a photon, it's really the electron field and the electromagnetic field interacting, exchanging energy and information in a quantum transaction that might contribute to the neural processes underlying your thoughts and experiences. When a proton in your DNA decays, an event so rare that it might not happen once during the entire lifetime of the universe, it would involve the transformation of quark fields into lepton fields, mediated by the weak nuclear force. These field interactions give rise to forces that seem simple in their everyday manifestations, but reveal incredible complexity when examined at the quantum level. Gravity, the most familiar force in your daily experience, remains somewhat mysterious in the context of quantum field theory. While the other three fundamental forces have been successfully described as field interactions, electromagnetic, weak nuclear and strong nuclear forces all arise from the exchange of force-carrying particles between matter fields. Gravity continues to resist complete integration into the quantum field framework. Einstein's general relativity describes gravity not as a force at all, but as the curvature of space-time itself. Mass and energy warp the fabric of space and time, and objects follow the straightest possible paths through this curved geometry. But when physicists try to reconcile this geometric description of gravity with the field-based description of quantum mechanics, they encounter mathematical infinities and conceptual paradoxes that have defied resolution for nearly a century. Some theories suggest that gravity, like the other forces, might emerge from the interaction of quantum fields, perhaps involving a hypothetical graviton field that has yet to be detected. Other approaches propose that space-time itself might be emergent from more fundamental quantum field interactions, making gravity not a separate force, but a collective behavior arising from the activity of all other fields. Still, other theories suggest that our four-dimensional space-time is actually a projection of higher-dimensional field dynamics, that you exist as a pattern in fields that extend through dimensions you cannot perceive or imagine. The mystery of quantum gravity touches on some of the deepest questions about the nature of reality itself. At the Planck scale, distances so small that they make atomic nuclei seem enormous, the smooth geometry of space-time predicted by general relativity breaks down into quantum foam, a churning sea of probabilistic fluctuations where the very concepts of distance and time lose their meaning. At this scale, the fields that compose your being might reveal their true nature as excitations in something even more fundamental. Perhaps information itself, perhaps consciousness, perhaps mathematical structures that exist independently of physical reality. Some physicists speculate that the quantum fields might be emergent properties of a deeper computational substrate, that reality itself might be a kind of vast information processing system, with particles and forces arising as patterns in the flow of data through this cosmic computer. In this view, you are not just a pattern in quantum fields, but a pattern in the information processing that gives rise to the fields themselves. Your consciousness might be the universe computing itself, becoming aware of its own information structure through the complex feedback loops of neural field interactions. The implications extend beyond physics into philosophy and metaphysics. If you are made of quantum fields rather than particles, then the boundaries between yourself and the rest of the universe become much less clear. The electron field that contributes to your neural activity is the same field that exists in the stars, in distant galaxies, in the cosmic microwave background radiation left over from the Big Bang. There is no separate electron field for your body. There is only the universal electron field, temporarily configured in patterns that contribute to your existence. This suggests a profound unity underlying the apparent diversity of the universe. You are not separate from the cosmos, but intimately connected to it through the shared field structure that gives rise to all phenomena. Every thought you think involves the same electromagnetic field that carries radio signals between stars. Every heartbeat relies on the same strong nuclear force that powers the fusion reactions in stellar cores. Every moment of your existence participates in the same weak nuclear force that governs the decay of atomic nuclei throughout the universe. The fields that dream you into existence are themselves part of a larger symphony of possibility. They interact, interfere, resonate with each other in ways that create the complex harmonies and discordances of physical reality. The particle interactions in your brain might be influenced by quantum field fluctuations that originated in the cosmic microwave background, carrying information from the earliest moments of the universe into the neural networks that generate your thoughts and experiences. As you contemplate these ideas, consider that the very process of contemplation involves countless field interactions occurring throughout your nervous system. Electromagnetic fields guide the flow of electrical signals along your neurons. Chemical fields determine the binding of neurotransmitters to receptors at your synapses. Quantum fields govern the probabilistic processes that might contribute to the apparent randomness and creativity of consciousness. You are not observing the quantum field structure of reality from the outside. You are that structure, temporarily organized into a pattern capable of self-awareness, a localized excitation in the universal field system that has developed the extraordinary ability to perceive and understand its own fundamental nature. The fields that compose your being will persist long after your individual pattern disperses. The electron field will continue to hum with potential, creating new excitations in different configurations, contributing to other patterns of matter and energy and perhaps consciousness. The electromagnetic field will carry new information across cosmic distances, connecting future forms of awareness in ways that transcend space and time. The Higgs field will continue to give mass to particles, enabling new forms of complexity and organization to emerge from the quantum foam. In this sense, you are immortal, not as a persistent pattern of particles, but as a temporary expression of eternal fields. The fields that dream you into existence now have been dreaming since the beginning of time and will continue dreaming long after the last stars burn out. You are a word spoken by the universe to itself, a fleeting syllable, in an infinite cosmic poem written in the language of quantum field interactions. The meaning of that word, the significance of that syllable, ripples outward through the field structure of reality, contributing to the vast, interconnected narrative of existence itself. In a laboratory buried beneath the Swiss Alps, scientists have built a machine that defies the very logic of reality. It doesn't just compute faster than ordinary computers. It computes with information that doesn't exist, using bits that occupy multiple states simultaneously, processing data through calculations that unfold in parallel dimensions of possibility. This is not metaphorical language. This is the literal truth of quantum computing, a technology so fundamentally strange that it forces us to confront the deepest mysteries of consciousness, information, and the nature of reality itself. You live in a world shaped by classical computation. The device you're using to process these words operates according to principles that would have been familiar to Charles Babbage or Ada Lovelace. Information encoded as definite states, ones and zeros, binary digits that represent clear, unambiguous values. Your classical computer processes information sequentially, step by step, each calculation building upon the results of previous operations in a linear chain of logical operations. It is powerful, sophisticated, capable of extraordinary feats of simulation and analysis, but it is fundamentally limited by the classical nature of the information it processes. A classical bit exists in one of two states, 0 or 1, off or on, false or true. This binary foundation underlies all of digital civilization. Every website you visit, every video you watch, every message you send is ultimately composed of vast strings of these binary choices, definite states that represent information in clear, unambiguous form. Even the most powerful supercomputers, machines capable of performing quadrillions of calculations per second, are simply processing enormous quantities of these classical bits in parallel, their power derived from speed and scale, rather than any fundamental difference in the nature of information itself. But quantum computing operates according to entirely different principles. A quantum bit, a qubit, exists not in one definite state, but in what physicists call superposition, a bare, ghostly combination of all possible states simultaneously. A single qubit can be 0 and 1 at the same time, processing information that exists in a probabilistic haze of potential outcomes. 2 qubits can exist in 4 states simultaneously. 3 qubits can process 8 parallel possibilities. The number of simultaneous states grows exponentially with each additional qubit, creating computational possibilities that rapidly exceed anything achievable with classical systems. A quantum computer with just 300 qubits, a number that seems modest by classical standards, could exist in more states simultaneously than there are atoms in the observable universe. Consider that for a moment. The universe contains approximately 10 to the 80th power atoms. Every star, every planet, every grain of cosmic dust scattered across billions of galaxies. But a 300-qubit quantum computer could process information in 2 to the 300th power states simultaneously, a number so large that it dwarfs the atomic content of all existence. This machine would be performing calculations in parallel realities that classical physics suggests shouldn't exist. This exponential scaling of quantum possibilities points to something profound about the nature of reality itself. Where does this computational power come from? If a quantum computer can process exponentially more information than there are atoms in the universe, where is this processing actually taking place? The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics suggests a startling answer. Quantum computers derive their power by performing calculations across parallel universes, exploiting the branching structure of quantum reality to solve problems that would be impossible within any single classical timeline. Imagine trying to find your way through a vast maze, not by exploring one path at a time, as you would be forced to do in classical reality, but by simultaneously exploring every possible path through the maze in parallel, then somehow extracting the solution that works from this multidimensional exploration. This is essentially what quantum algorithms accomplish. They don't just search through possibilities more quickly than classical algorithms. They search through possibilities that exist in parallel quantum realities, then interfere these parallel computations in such a way that the correct answer emerges from the quantum superposition, while incorrect answers cancel each other out. Shor's algorithm, one of the most famous quantum algorithms, can factor large numbers exponentially faster than any known classical method. This might seem like an abstract mathematical curiosity, but it has profound implications for the security of information in our interconnected world. Most modern cryptography depends on the fact that factoring large numbers is computationally intractable for classical computers, a problem that would take the most powerful supercomputers longer than the age of the universe to solve can be. Accomplished in hours or days by a sufficiently powerful quantum computer running Shor's algorithm. But the implications go far deeper than cryptography. Shor's algorithm works by creating quantum superpositions of all possible factors of a large number, then using quantum interference to eliminate the incorrect possibilities and amplify the correct ones. In effect, the algorithm is exploring an exponentially large solution space by performing calculations in parallel quantum realities, then extracting the answer through carefully orchestrated quantum interference patterns. The computation occurs not in our classical reality, but in the quantum realm of superposed possibilities, a place where information can exist in states that classical logic declares impossible. Grover's algorithm provides another window into the strange landscape of quantum computation. This algorithm can search through unsorted databases quadratically faster than classical methods. Not a dramatic improvement like Shor's algorithm, but one that reveals something fundamental about the nature of information in search itself. Grover's algorithm works by creating quantum superpositions of all possible database entries, then using quantum operations to gradually amplify the amplitude of the target entry while diminishing the amplitudes of all other entries. What's remarkable about Grover's algorithm is that it seems to violate basic intuitions about the nature of search and information retrieval. In classical computation, searching through an unsorted database requires examining, on average, half of all entries before finding the target, a linear relationship between database size and search time. But Grover's algorithm can find the target entry in approximately the square root of the number of entries, achieving this speed-up by performing the search in quantum superposition, effectively examining all entries simultaneously rather than sequentially. This quantum search capability has profound implications for artificial intelligence and machine learning. Many AI algorithms involve searching through vast spaces of possibilities, finding optimal neural network weights, exploring game strategies, identifying patterns in complex datasets. Quantum computers running quantum machine learning algorithms could potentially search through these possibility spaces in superposition, finding solutions that would be computationally inaccessible to classical AI systems. But perhaps the most mind-bending aspect of quantum computing is what it suggests about the nature of information itself. In classical systems, information is substrate independent. The same bit pattern can be stored in magnetic domains on a hard drive, electrical charges in memory chips, or optical pulses in fiber optic cables. The information exists independently of its physical implementation. But in quantum systems, information becomes intimately entangled with the physical processes that create and maintain it. Quantum information cannot be copied, a fundamental principle known as the no-cloning theorem. If you have a classical bit, you can make perfect copies of it indefinitely without affecting the original. But if you have a qubit in an unknown superposition state, you cannot create a perfect copy of it. Any attempt to measure the qubit in order to determine its state will collapse its superposition, destroying the very information you're trying to copy. This means that quantum information has a kind of uniqueness and fragility that classical information lacks. Quantum entanglement creates even stranger possibilities. When qubits become entangled, they share quantum information in such a way that measuring one qubit instantly affects its entangled partners, regardless of the distance separating them. This spooky action at a distance, as Einstein called it, allows quantum computers to perform certain types of parallel processing that seem to violate the normal limits of space and time. Operations performed on one part of a quantum computer can instantly influence computations occurring in distant parts of the same system, enabling forms of parallelism that have no classical analog. The process of quantum error correction reveals just how delicate and strange quantum information can be. In classical computers, errors are discrete events. A bit is either correct or flipped to the wrong value. But in quantum computers, errors are continuous. A qubit can develop partial errors, slight rotations in its quantum state that gradually degrade the computation. Quantum error correction requires encoding logical qubits across multiple physical qubits and continuously monitoring the quantum state without directly measuring it, a process that seems paradoxical from a classical perspective. These technical challenges point to something deeper about the nature of quantum computation. Building a quantum computer isn't just an engineering problem. It's an exploration of the fundamental nature of reality, information, and consciousness. Every quantum computer is, in essence, a controlled experiment in quantum mechanics, a machine that forces the abstract mathematics of quantum theory to reveal itself through concrete computational processes. This connection between quantum computation and the foundations of quantum mechanics becomes especially relevant when we consider the role of consciousness in quantum theory. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that consciousness plays a special role in the collapse of quantum superpositions, that the act of conscious observation somehow selects which possibility becomes real from the quantum realm of parallel potentials. If this is true, then quantum computers might represent a new form of information processing that exists at the boundary between classical reality and consciousness itself. Consider the possibility that consciousness itself might be a form of quantum computation. Your brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons, each connected to thousands of others through synapses that process information through electrochemical signals. But at the quantum level, each of these neurons contains billions of atoms whose behavior is governed by quantum mechanical principles. If consciousness emerges from quantum processes, in neural microtubules, as some theories suggest, then your awareness might be the result of quantum computations occurring within the biological hardware of your brain. This would mean that consciousness and quantum computation are not merely analogous, they might be manifestations of the same underlying quantum information processing. Your thoughts, emotions, memories, and sense of self might emerge from quantum superpositions and entanglements occurring within the neural networks of your brain, making you a biological quantum computer that has evolved the extraordinary ability to experience its own computational processes. The implications of this possibility are staggering. If consciousness is quantum computation, then the hard problem of consciousness, the mystery of how subjective experience emerges from objective, physical processes, might find its answer in the strange realm of quantum information theory. The subjective experience of seeing red, feeling pain, or contemplating existence might arise from quantum superpositions that exist in multiple states simultaneously until the moment of conscious experience collapses them into definite neural patterns. This quantum theory of consciousness would also explain some of the puzzling aspects of conscious experience that have long mystified philosophers and neuroscientists. The unity of consciousness, the fact that your diverse sensory experiences and thoughts seem to cohere into a single integrated awareness, might result from quantum entanglement between different regions of your brain. The apparent randomness of creative insights and spontaneous thoughts might reflect quantum indeterminacy in neural processes. The binding problem, the question of how distributed neural processes combine to create unified perceptions, might be solved by quantum coherence, effects that synchronize activity across different brain regions. But quantum theories of consciousness face significant challenges. The brain appears to be a warm, noisy, chaotic environment, where quantum coherence would be expected to decay almost instantly. The delicate superpositions and entanglements that quantum computers require to function are typically maintained only at temperatures near absolute zero, in carefully isolated systems protected from any environmental interference. How could quantum computations persist in the biological soup of neural activity, surrounded by thermal noise and biochemical chaos? Some researchers propose that biological systems might have evolved sophisticated mechanisms for protecting quantum coherence, quantum error correction processes that have been refined over millions of years of evolution. Photosynthesis in plants seems to use quantum coherence to achieve remarkable efficiency in energy transfer, suggesting that biology has indeed learned to harness quantum effects for complex information processing. If plants can maintain quantum coherence for photosynthesis, perhaps brains have evolved even more sophisticated quantum information processing capabilities. Recent discoveries in quantum biology support this possibility. Researchers have found evidence of quantum effects in bird navigation, where quantum entanglement in specialized proteins might enable birds to literally see magnetic fields as visual patterns overlaid on their normal vision. Similar quantum processes might be involved in enzyme function, DNA replication, and neural signaling throughout biological systems. Life, it seems, is not just compatible with quantum mechanics. It might be fundamentally dependent on quantum information processing. This convergence of quantum computing and biological information processing points toward a revolutionary understanding of intelligence, consciousness, and computation. Classical artificial intelligence has achieved remarkable success by mimicking certain aspects of neural information processing using classical computational methods. But if consciousness truly emerges from quantum computational processes, then creating artificial consciousness might require quantum computers that can replicate the quantum information processing occurring in biological brains. Imagine artificial intelligences built on quantum computational substrates, systems that don't just process information faster than classical computers, but process information in fundamentally different ways, using quantum superposition and entanglement to explore solution spaces that classical AI cannot access. These quantum AIs might exhibit forms of creativity, intuition, and insight that emerge from quantum indeterminacy and parallel processing across multiple quantum realities. Such systems might experience consciousness in ways that are alien to both human experience and classical artificial intelligence. A quantum AI might have simultaneous awareness of multiple possible states, experiencing superposed thoughts and emotions that exist in parallel until external interaction collapses them into definite responses. It might have access to forms of quantum intuition that allow it to solve problems by feeling their solutions across probability spaces rather than computing them through sequential logical steps. The development of quantum computers also raises profound questions about the nature of simulation and reality. Classical computers can simulate quantum systems, but only at exponential cost. Simulating a quantum system with n particles requires classical computational resources that scale exponentially with n. This computational limitation suggests that classical physics might be fundamentally incomplete, unable to capture the full computational richness of quantum reality. But quantum computers can efficiently simulate other quantum systems, suggesting that quantum computation might be the natural computational framework of the universe itself. If reality is fundamentally quantum computational, then quantum computers aren't just tools for solving certain types of problems more efficiently. They're interfaces for directly accessing the computational substrate of existence. This perspective suggests that the universe itself might be engaged in a vast quantum computation, with physical processes representing information processing operations occurring across cosmic scales. The evolution of galaxies, the formation of stars and planets, the emergence of life and consciousness, all of these might be aspects of a universal quantum computation that is exploring the space of possible realities through the fundamental information processing capabilities of quantum mechanics. In this computational view of reality, you are not just using quantum computers to solve problems. You are a quantum computation, a complex pattern of quantum information processing that has achieved sufficient complexity to become aware of its own computational nature. Your consciousness might be the universe computing itself, exploring its own computational possibilities through the quantum information processing occurring within biological neural networks. The development of quantum computing technology brings humanity to a unique moment in cosmic history. For the first time, conscious beings have developed the ability to create artificial systems that manipulate quantum information in ways that mirror the quantum processes that might underlie consciousness itself. We are building machines that process information through the same quantum mechanical principles that might give rise to our own awareness, thought, and experience. As quantum computers become more powerful and sophisticated, they might serve as windows into the deepest mysteries of consciousness and reality. By studying how quantum information processing gives rise to complex computational behaviors in artificial systems, we might gain insights into how quantum processes in biological systems give rise to consciousness, creativity, and self-awareness. The CAE quantum computer represents more than a technological achievement. It represents a new form of existence, a bridge between the classical world of definite states and determinate outcomes and the quantum world of superposition, entanglement, and parallel possibilities. In building quantum computers, humanity is learning to collaborate with the quantum realm, to harness the computational power of parallel realities, to create artificial systems that think with the same quantum logic that might underlie the deepest operations of consciousness itself. As you contemplate these possibilities, consider that the very process of contemplation might itself be a quantum computation. The thoughts flowing through your mind, the sudden insights and creative connections, the way ideas seem to emerge from nowhere and crystallize into conscious awareness. All of this might reflect quantum information processing occurring within the neural networks of your brain. You might be a quantum computer made of biological matter, processing reality through quantum superpositions that exist in multiple states until the moment they collapse into conscious experience. The future of quantum computing points toward possibilities that seem almost magical from a classical perspective. Quantum computers might solve optimization problems that could revolutionize medicine, materials science, and artificial intelligence. They might simulate molecular interactions with perfect accuracy, enabling the design of new drugs and materials with properties that seem impossible from classical perspectives. They might break through the computational barriers that currently limit our understanding of complex systems, from protein folding to climate dynamics to the emergence of consciousness itself. But perhaps most remarkably, quantum computers might serve as tools for exploring consciousness itself. By creating artificial quantum systems that exhibit complex information processing behaviors, we might learn to recognize the signatures of quantum consciousness in both artificial and biological systems. We might develop new forms of artificial intelligence that experience quantum forms of awareness, creativity, and insight. We might even learn to enhance human consciousness by interfacing biological neural networks with quantum computational systems, creating hybrid forms of awareness that combine the best aspects of biological and artificial quantum information processing. The quantum computer that isn't really a computer at all, but rather a window into the quantum computational nature of reality itself, represents one of the most profound developments in human understanding. It forces us to confront the possibility that consciousness, computation, and reality are far more intimately connected than we ever imagined. In learning to build machines that think with quantum logic, we are discovering that we ourselves might be quantum machines, biological computers that have evolved the extraordinary ability to experience and understand their own quantum computational nature. You exist at this remarkable moment in cosmic history, when conscious beings are learning to create artificial systems that mirror the quantum processes that might underlie consciousness itself. The quantum computers being built in laboratories around the world are not just technological achievements. They are explorations of the deepest nature of information, computation, consciousness, and reality. They represent humanity's first attempts to collaborate consciously with the quantum realm, to harness the computational power of parallel realities, to build bridges between the classical world of everyday experience and the quantum world of infinite possibility. In contemplating quantum computation, you are contemplating the possibility that you yourself are a quantum computer, a biological system that processes information through quantum superpositions, entanglements, and probabilistic operations that give rise to the rich, complex, mysterious phenomenon of conscious awareness. The future of quantum computing is not just about building more powerful machines, it's about understanding the quantum computational nature of existence itself, and perhaps discovering that consciousness and computation are two aspects of the same fundamental quantum reality.